Picture this, a cold morning in June of the year 793. The monks of Lindisfarne are going about their daily routines on their island sanctuary off the coast of Northumbria. They've lived here in peace for generations, copying manuscripts, praying, tending their gardens. The sea stretches out endlessly before them, a barrier they believe keeps them safe from the troubles of the world. Then, on the horizon, dark shapes emerge from the mist. Long, low vessels with strange curved prows cutting through the water with impossible speed. Within hours, everything these monks know will be torn apart and the world will never be the same. This is the beginning of the Viking Age, but it's not the beginning of their story. Tonight, we're going back further, deeper, into the cold fjords of Scandinavia to understand how a scattered collection of farmers and fishermen became the most feared and respected seafarers in medieval history. But before we dive into this journey through time, if you're enjoying these late-night historical journeys, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Drowsy Archivist. Your support helps me continue bringing you these detailed explorations of the past. And hit that notification bell so you never miss our next adventure into history. Now, let's begin our voyage into the world of the Vikings, starting not with their raids, but with their beginnings in a land of ice and stone where survival itself was an act of courage. Long before the dragon ships appeared on foreign shores, Scandinavia was a world unto itself. The 8th century opened on a land of dramatic contrasts, where towering mountains plunged into deep fjords, where summer brought endless daylight and winter wrapped the world in perpetual twilight. This was not a gentle land. It demanded everything from those who called it home. In what we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the people lived in scattered settlements, their lives dictated by the rhythms of seasons and the challenges of a harsh climate. These weren't the Vikings yet, not in the way history would come to define them. They were farmers primarily, working the thin strips of arable land wedged between forest and fjord. They were fishermen, casting nets into cold waters that provided sustenance even when the land itself seemed barren. They were craftspeople, metal workers, weavers, shipbuilders, each skill passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. The longhouse stood at the center of their world, massive timber structures that could stretch 30 meters or more in length. Inside, smoke from the central hearth filled the air, eventually escaping through gaps in the thatched roof. Families lived, worked, ate, and slept in these communal spaces, sharing warmth during the brutal Scandinavian winters. The wealthy might partition off private sleeping quarters, but for most, privacy was a luxury unknown. Animals often occupied one end of the longhouse during winter, their body heat adding to the collective warmth that meant the difference between life and death when storms howled outside. Life revolved around agriculture, but farming in Scandinavia demanded adaptation. The growing season was short, sometimes brutally so. Barley thrived better than wheat in the cool climate, and the people learned to make the most of what the land offered. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They hunted deer, elk, and wild boar in the endless forests. They gathered nuts, berries, and wild plants. Nothing was wasted. Every resource was precious. The society was stratified even then. At the top stood the jarls, the landowners who controlled territories and commanded the loyalty of those beneath them. These were the wealthy families, the ones with the largest longhouses, the finest possessions, the most cattle and slaves. Below them came the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who owned their own land, made their own decisions, but owed certain obligations to their jarls. And at the bottom, the thralls, the enslaved people who had no freedom, no rights, who could be bought and sold like livestock. But something was changing in the decades before 793. Several forces were converging that would transform this relatively isolated population into a civilization of explorers, traders, and warriors who would reshape medieval Europe. Population pressure was mounting. Better farming techniques and a period of relative peace had led to population growth. But Scandinavia had only so much arable land. The practice of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the family farm, left younger sons with limited options. They could work as laborers on someone else's land, they could learn a craft, or they could look elsewhere for opportunity and fortune. Climate played a role too. Paleoclimatological studies indicate that the 8th through 10th centuries experienced what's called the medieval warm period. Temperatures were slightly higher than in previous centuries. This meant longer growing seasons, less sea ice, and critically, more navigable waters for longer portions of the year. The seas that had been barriers became highways. But perhaps most important was technology. Scandinavian shipbuilding had been evolving for centuries, and by the mid-8th century, it had reached a level of sophistication that would enable everything that followed. The clinker-built construction method, where overlapping planks were riveted together to form a flexible, strong hull, created vessels unlike anything else in European waters. These ships were fast, maneuverable, and crucially, had shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers and land on beaches where other vessels couldn't go. The development of the true keel was revolutionary. Earlier boats had been essentially glorified canoes. The keel provided stability and allowed for the mounting of a proper mast and sail. Suddenly, Scandinavian vessels didn't need to rely solely on or power. They could harness the wind, traveling vast distances with relatively small crews. A ship that might carry 30 warriors needed only 6 or 8 men to sail it across open ocean. Navigation techniques were improving as well. These seafarers learned to read the subtle signs of nature. They watched the sun's position, tracked the stars at night. They understood how birds behaved and what that meant about nearby land. They read the colors and movements of the water itself. They developed primitive but effective navigation tools. Some evidence suggests they used sunstones, crystals that could locate the sun's position even through cloud cover by detecting polarized light. Trade networks already existed before the Viking Age proper. Scandinavian merchants had been traveling south to the Frisian coast, to the Baltic, exchanging furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves for silver, glass, wine, and luxury goods. These early traders brought back not just material goods but information, knowledge of wealthy monasteries, undefended towns, the weaknesses of foreign powers. The social structure itself encouraged martial prowess. Young men gained status through displays of courage, strength, and skill in combat. Raiding parties and small-scale conflicts between local chieftains were common. Violence wasn't an aberration in this society. It was woven into the social fabric, ritualized and celebrated in ways that would seem alien to us today. Religious beliefs reinforced this warrior culture. The Norse pantheon celebrated strength and bravery. Odin, the All-Father, welcomed fallen warriors to Valhalla, his great hall, where they would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. To die in battle was glorious. To die in bed of old age or illness was shameful. This worldview created generations of men who not only didn't fear death in combat but actively sought it as the path to eternal glory. The political landscape of Scandinavia in the 8th century was fragmented. There were no unified kingdoms yet, just a patchwork of territories controlled by various chieftains and petty kings. This decentralization meant that no single authority controlled raiding expeditions. A Jarl with enough followers could outfit a ship or two and go wherever opportunity called, without needing permission from any higher power. All these factors, population pressure, climate change, technological advancement, trade opportunities, cultural values, political fragmentation, were like dry kindling waiting for a spark. And when that spark came, when the first raiders discovered how vulnerable and wealthy the monasteries of England and Ireland were, the Viking Age exploded into being with terrifying speed. But we need to understand that even in these pre-Viking centuries, Scandinavians were not isolated primitives. They were accomplished metal workers, creating intricate jewelry and deadly weapons. They were poets who composed complex verses celebrating heroes and gods. They were lawmakers who had developed sophisticated legal codes and methods of settling disputes. They were traders who understood the value of different goods and how to negotiate favorable deals. Their religion was animistic and polytheistic, seeing divine forces in nature, in thunder and waves, in the growth of crops and the birth of children. Sacred groves dotted the landscape, places where sacrifices were made to ensure good harvests or victory in battle. Seeresses, women with supposed prophetic abilities, held positions of respect and influence. The supernatural was as real to these people as the physical world, perhaps more so. Family honor meant everything. An insult to one member was an insult to all. Vengeance was not just a right but an obligation. This concept of family reputation would drive much of the conflict in the Viking Age, creating blood feuds that could last generations. Women in this pre-Viking society had more rights and independence than their counterparts in Christian Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, inherit wealth, and manage farms while their husbands were away. They couldn't participate in the thing, the assembly where free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes. But within the household, their authority was substantial. The household economy depended heavily on women's work. They spun wool, wove cloth, prepared and preserved food, managed servants and slaves, raised children, and in their husband's absence, made critical decisions about the farm's operation. A wealthy woman's keys, worn on a chain at her waist, were symbols of her authority over the household stores and treasures. Children were raised communally in many ways, with older children helping care for younger ones. Boys learned farming, hunting, and fighting from their fathers and other men in the community. Girls learned textile production, food preparation, and household management from their mothers and other women. But the division wasn't absolute. Everyone needed to know something of everything because survival demanded versatility. Education was oral. Knowledge was passed through stories, songs, and direct instruction. Memory was valued and cultivated. Young men memorized genealogies going back generations, learning who their ancestors were, what they had done, how they had died. This sense of connection to the past gave each person a place in an unbroken chain stretching back to the gods themselves. Entertainment came from storytelling, games, and feasts. Skilled poets, the skalds, were highly valued for their ability to compose verses celebrating heroic deeds or mocking enemies. Board games like Nefatafel provided intellectual challenge during long winter nights. And when harvests were good or victories won, communal feasts brought communities together in celebrations that could last days. The landscape shaped everything. Fjords created natural boundaries and highways simultaneously. Mountains made overland travel difficult, so water travel became essential. Forests provided timber for ships, buildings, and fuel, but also harbored dangers: bears, wolves, and in the imagination, trolls and other supernatural threats. The sea was both provider and threat, source of food and pathway to elsewhere, but also a deadly force that claimed lives regularly. Winters were tests of preparation and endurance. Food had to be preserved, dried, salted, smoked, or stored. Enough fuel had to be gathered to last months. Animals needed shelter and fodder. A mistake in preparation could mean starvation before spring. No wonder these people developed a culture that valued foresight, hard work, and communal cooperation. Yet for all the hardships there was beauty too. Summer nights when the sun barely set, bathing everything in soft golden light. The aurora borealis dancing in winter skies. The profound silence of a snow-covered forest. These people were shaped by their environment, but they also found meaning and even joy in it. As the 8th century progressed toward its final decade, all the elements were in place. The ships were ready. The men were ready. The knowledge of vulnerable targets across the sea was percolating through Scandinavian society. What was needed was simply for someone to make the leap, to organize an expedition not for trade but for plunder, to prove that such an enterprise could succeed spectacularly. We don't know who made the decision to raid Lindisfarne. History doesn't record the name of the Jarl who thought, "Let us sail to that island monastery we've heard about and see what wealth we might take." But someone did make that decision, and on a June morning in 793, everything changed. The world was about to discover that the seemingly quiet people of the north were capable of extraordinary violence, but also extraordinary courage, remarkable seamanship, and would ultimately leave an indelible mark on medieval civilization that echoes down to us today. The attack on Lindisfarne on June 8, 793, was not subtle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our primary sources for the event, describes it in terms that convey genuine shock and horror. The monastery of Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, sat off the coast of Northumbria in northeastern England. It was one of the most important religious centers in the Anglo-Saxon world, founded in the 6th century by Saint Aidan. For nearly 2 centuries, monks had lived there in relative peace, creating illuminated manuscripts, preserving classical learning, training new generations of clergy. The island was visible from the mainland at low tide, even reachable by walking across tidal flats. But it was isolated enough that the monks felt secure. No one expected an attack from the sea. Naval warfare existed, of course, but it typically involved known enemies, coastal conflicts between established powers. The idea that raiders would cross the North Sea specifically to attack a monastery was simply outside the realm of expectation. When the dragon ships appeared, the monks had no context for what they were seeing. These weren't trading vessels making a peaceful visit. These were longships, perhaps 2 or 3 of them, carrying anywhere from 30 to 50 men each. The ships beached directly on the shore and warriors poured out, armed with axes, swords, and spears. What happened next was brutality inflicted on people who had no means and no training to resist. Monasteries were not fortified in this period. They were spiritual sanctuaries, not military installations. The monks were scholars, not soldiers. Some were killed outright, cut down as they tried to flee or defend their sacred spaces. Others were taken captive, destined to be sold as slaves in Scandinavian or continental markets. The church itself was desecrated, its altar torn apart, its precious metal objects looted, its holy relics scattered or destroyed. The raiders took everything of value. Gold and silver religious vessels were particularly prized. Illuminated manuscripts, priceless to us as historical artifacts, were worthless to the raiders except as objects that might have jeweled covers. Those covers were ripped off, the parchment discarded. Stores of food and drink were seized. The attack was over relatively quickly, a few hours of overwhelming violence, and then the ships departed as swiftly as they had arrived, laden with plunder and captives. The psychological impact was immense. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the great intellectual figures of the age, wrote to the King of Northumbria, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." This sense of violation, of a fundamental breach in the order of things, reverberates through contemporary accounts. Monasteries were supposed to be inviolable. Even in conflicts between Christian kingdoms, there were certain rules, certain boundaries not crossed. The Vikings recognized no such boundaries. To them, a monastery was simply a wealthy, poorly defended target. The religious significance that made these places sacred to Christians was meaningless to raiders who honored Odin and Thor. Lindisfarne was not the only target that year or the next. The monastery at Jarrow in Northumbria was attacked in 794. The raiders were less successful there, with some sources indicating that their leader was killed and storms destroyed their ships. But successful or not, the attacks continued. In 795, monasteries in Ireland, including Iona, were struck. The pattern was clear. Vikings were targeting Christian religious sites along the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Why monasteries? The reasons were pragmatic. Monasteries accumulated wealth through donations, held valuable religious objects made of precious metals, stored agricultural surplus, and were typically undefended. They were also often located in isolated coastal or river locations, exactly the kind of places Viking ships could reach easily but that were far from military support. The wealth of these institutions was real and substantial. The Catholic Church was one of the richest institutions in medieval Europe. Individual monasteries might have treasuries containing gold chalices, silver candlesticks, jeweled reliquaries, and coin hoards. They had libraries filled with manuscripts, some with covers encrusted with gems. They owned land, livestock, and stores of grain. To a Viking raiding party, a monastery was a treasure vault with minimal security. But the raiders didn't restrict themselves to religious targets. Coastal towns and villages were also vulnerable. Any settlement within reach of the sea or navigable rivers was at risk. The Viking strategy was consistent. Arrive suddenly, overwhelm any resistance through superior numbers and ferocity, seize portable wealth and captives, and depart before organized military force could respond. The longship made this strategy possible. These vessels were marvels of engineering that gave Vikings capabilities no other European power could match. A typical longship might be 20 to 30 meters long but less than 5 meters wide. The hull was built using the clinker method, with overlapping oak planks riveted together. This created a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to twist slightly with the waves rather than fighting them. The shallow draft was critical. A loaded longship might draw only 1 meter of water or even less. This meant they could navigate rivers far inland, travel in coastal waters too shallow for other vessels, and most importantly, beach directly on shores. There was no need for ports or harbors. A Viking raiding party could pull their ship up on any beach, conduct their raid, and launch again within hours. The symmetrical ends meant the ship could reverse direction without turning around. The bow and stern were essentially identical, both rising in elegant curves, often carved with fearsome animal heads. When beaching, the crew could simply row backward to depart, a significant tactical advantage when speed was essential. Propulsion came from both sail and oars. The single square sail, made of wool woven so tightly it could catch even moderate wind, allowed for swift travel across open water. When winds were unfavorable or when maneuvering in tight spaces like rivers, the crew would row. A 30-man crew could maintain impressive speeds for extended periods, and the Vikings were experienced enough to coordinate their rowing into an efficient, powerful rhythm. Steering was accomplished through a side rudder mounted on the starboard side, the term itself deriving from the Old Norse word for steering board, styrbord. The helmsman used a tiller connected to this rudder, allowing for precise control. These ships could make sharp turns, navigate complex coastal waters, and handle rough seas with a competence that amazed and terrified their victims. The construction process for a longship was intensive and required master craftsmen. It began with selecting the right trees, typically oak for the hull strakes and keel, pine or spruce for lighter internal structures. The trees had to be old-growth specimens with straight grain. Builders would split the logs along the grain using wedges, creating planks that were stronger than sawn lumber because they followed the wood's natural fiber structure. The keel was laid first, a single massive timber that formed the ship's backbone. Then the stems, the curved pieces. Once the hull shell was complete, the shipbuilders inserted the ribs, the internal frames that gave the hull additional strength and provided attachment points for the crossbeams. Critically, these ribs were not the primary structural element as they would be in later ship designs. The clinker-built shell itself provided the main strength, with the ribs adding support. This meant the hull could flex with the waves, making for a more seaworthy vessel. The deck was laid or holes were cut in the upper strakes and rowing benches were installed. A massive block of wood was set amidships to hold the mast, which itself might be 15 meters tall. The mast could be raised and lowered, allowing ships to pass under bridges or to lower their profile in stealth approaches. Shields were often mounted along the ship's sides, overlapping like scales. These provided some protection to the crew and created the classic Viking ship profile that inspired such dread. The shields were colorful, painted in bright reds, yellows, and blues, making the approaching vessels visible from a distance. Building a longship required considerable resources. A single vessel might take a year or more to construct and require the labor of numerous skilled craftsmen. The wood alone represented a significant investment. The iron for rivets, the wool for sails, the rope for rigging, all these materials had to be gathered or purchased. A longship was a community project, typically sponsored by a wealthy jarl who could afford the expense and who would lead the expeditions the ship enabled. But the investment paid off spectacularly. A single successful raid could yield wealth exceeding the ship's construction cost many times over. Silver alone was precious in Scandinavia, where silver mines were scarce. A ship that returned heavy with silver, gold, valuable goods, and captives to be sold made its sponsor wealthy and enhanced his status tremendously. The raids on Britain and Ireland continued throughout the late 8th and early 9th centuries. What began as opportunistic summer expeditions evolved into more organized campaigns. Raiders began overwintering in Ireland by the 830s, establishing fortified camps that served as bases for extended operations. Dublin itself was founded as a Viking settlement around 841, evolving from a raiding base into a permanent town and eventually into one of Ireland's most important cities. The pattern was similar in England. Initial hit-and-run raids gave way to larger expeditions that stayed longer and penetrated deeper inland. The Vikings learned which areas were weakest, which kingdoms were in disarray, where the richest targets lay. They adapted their tactics, sometimes even making temporary alliances with local factions in complex political situations. The Anglo-Saxon response was initially inadequate. The various kingdoms of England were often at odds with each other, making coordinated defense difficult. When one kingdom was raided, others might not help, calculating that the Vikings would move on eventually. Local forces were militias, not professional armies, and they were no match for experienced Viking warriors in open combat. Gradually, defenses improved. Watchtowers were built along coasts to provide early warning. Fortifications were strengthened. Military reforms created more effective fighting forces. But this took decades, and meanwhile the Vikings were learning, adapting, and growing bolder. The establishment of the Danelaw in England represents the culmination of this phase of Viking expansion. The Danelaw was the region of England under Viking control, roughly the northeastern portion of the country. It came into being through a series of conquests and agreements in the late 9th century. The Great Heathen Army, a substantial Viking force that arrived in England in 865, defeated several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and established Viking rule over large territories. By 878, after the Treaty of Wedmore between the Viking leader Guthrum and King Alfred of Wessex, the division of England was formalized. The Danelaw had its own laws, its own administrative systems, many based on Scandinavian practices. Towns and villages in the Danelaw often had Scandinavian names or incorporated Old Norse elements. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, Toft, and Thwaite are indicators of Viking settlement instilled at the landscape of northern and eastern England today. The impact on English language was profound. Old Norse and Old English were related languages, both Germanic in origin but distinct. In the Danelaw they came into daily contact. This linguistic melting pot enriched English with hundreds of Norse-derived words. Basic everyday words like sky, egg, knife, window, husband, and they come from Old Norse. The influence runs deep, affecting grammar and pronunciation as well as vocabulary. Viking raids on Francia, what is now France, followed a similar pattern. The Seine River provided a highway deep into Frankish territory. In 845, a fleet led by Ragnar, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, though the historicity is debated, sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris. The city was poorly defended, and the Vikings extracted a huge payment of silver to leave, some 7,000 pounds of silver. This introduced another dimension to Viking interaction with European powers: tribute. The Anglo-Saxon term was dangeld, Danish gold, payments made to Vikings to persuade them not to raid or to leave. From the Viking perspective, this was an excellent arrangement. They could gain wealth without the risks of battle. From the victim's perspective, it was extortion, but often seemed preferable to the destruction a raid would bring. The problem with dangeld was that it incentivized more raids. If one group of Vikings could extract payment, others would try. And even after paying, there was no guarantee that different Viking groups wouldn't attack anyway, or that the same group wouldn't return the next year demanding more. Some historians argue that dangeld payments, while providing short-term relief, actually encouraged and financed further Viking aggression. The raids were not uniformly successful. Vikings suffered defeats too. At the Battle of Chartres in 857, Frankish forces defeated a Viking army besieging the city. Vikings were killed in shipwrecks and battles by disease. But overall, the raids were profitable enough and losses manageable enough that they continued for generations. Monasteries and churches adapted. Some were fortified. Others were abandoned, with monks fleeing inland or to safer locations. Valuable objects were hidden or moved. There are accounts of monks burying treasures to keep them from Viking hands, treasures that sometimes were never recovered and that archaeologists occasionally still discover. The psychological warfare aspect of Viking raids shouldn't be underestimated. The sudden appearance of dragon ships, the ferocity of the attacks, the desecration of holy sites, all created an atmosphere of terror that often exceeded the actual military threat. The Vikings cultivated a fearsome reputation. They knew that terrified enemies were less likely to resist effectively. Some of this reputation was undoubtedly exaggerated by Christian chroniclers who saw the Vikings as divine punishment for sin, savage heathens sent by God to chastise a wayward Christian population. But even accounting for exaggeration, the violence was real and traumatic for those who experienced it. Communities were shattered. People were killed or enslaved. Wealth accumulated over generations was plundered in hours. Yet this was also a period of intense cultural exchange, however violent the circumstances. Vikings brought Scandinavian artistic styles, language, customs, and legal concepts to the areas they settled. They were eventually influenced by the cultures they encountered. Viking settlers in the Danelaw in Ireland and Francia began to adopt local customs, to intermarry with local populations, to convert to Christianity, to integrate even as they maintained distinct identities. This first phase of Viking expansion, the raids on Western Europe, set patterns that would continue for 2 centuries. But while Norwegian and Danish Vikings were striking westward, Swedish Vikings were looking in a different direction entirely, east toward the vast river systems that would take them into the heart of what is now Russia, and ultimately to the richest cities of the medieval world. While their Norwegian and Danish cousins were raiding Britain, Ireland, and Francia, Swedish Vikings were opening entirely different frontiers in the east. This eastern expansion was less about sudden raids and more about trade, though violence certainly played a role. These Swedish adventurers, who would become known as the Russ, followed the river routes from the Baltic Sea deep into the interior of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, ultimately reaching the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The geography was perfect for the kind of mobility Viking ships provided. The Baltic Sea connects to numerous river systems. From the Gulf of Finland, the Neva River leads to Lake Ladoga. From there, the Fokov River leads to Lake Ilmen and onward to the headwaters of river systems that cross the Russian plain. The Volga River, the longest river in Europe, flows from the Valdai Hills south and east, ultimately reaching the Caspian Sea. The Dnieper River flows south through Ukraine to the Black Sea. These rivers weren't perfect highways. There were rapids, shallow sections, and places where the rivers came close to each other but didn't quite connect. But this is where the Viking ship design proved invaluable. The shallow draft meant these vessels could navigate in minimal water. When the river became too shallow or when portaging between river systems was necessary, the ships were light enough that crews could carry them overland. The Rus established a network of trading posts and settlements along these routes. One of the earliest and most important was Staraya Ladoga, founded around the mid-8th century at the mouth of the Fokov River where it enters Lake Ladoga. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive evidence of Scandinavian presence, characteristic building styles, artifacts, jewelry, and Norse styles. This was a mixed population center where Scandinavian, Slavic, and Finnic peoples interacted, traded, and eventually blended. From Staraya Latiga, the Rus pushed further south. The city of Novgorod, whose name translates roughly to New Town, was established as a major center of power. According to Russian chronicles, a Scandinavian prince named Rurik arrived in this region around 862, invited by Slavic and Finnic tribes to bring order to their fractious conflicts. Whether the invitation was genuine or whether Rurik simply imposed his rule is debated, but he established a dynasty that would rule Novgorod and later Kiev for centuries. The primary chronicle, the main source for early Russian history, was written centuries after the events it describes and is clearly legendary in parts. But it preserves traditions about the Rus' origins. It describes the Rus as Varangians, the Slavic term for Vikings, and explicitly connects them to Scandinavia. Modern archaeological and linguistic evidence strongly supports a Scandinavian origin for the ruling class of these early Russian states, though they quickly adopted Slavic language and culture. Kiev, located on the Dnieper River in modern Ukraine, became the most important Rus center. According to tradition, Rurik's successors Oleg and Igor captured Kiev from the Khazars in the late 9th century and made it their capital. Kiev's location was strategic. It sat on the Dnieper route to the Black Sea, connecting the Baltic world to the Byzantine Empire. The Rus engaged in both trade and tribute collection. They gathered furs, slaves, honey, wax, and amber from the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the northern forests and traded these goods southward. Slaves were a major component of this trade, captured in raids or purchased. The word slave itself derives from Slav, a linguistic testimony to the extensive slave trade from Eastern Europe in this period. The journey to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was long and dangerous. The Rus traveled down the Dnieper in fleets of ships, sometimes dozens of vessels together for mutual protection. The most dangerous obstacle was the Dnieper Rapids, a series of cataracts and rock-filled shallows that made navigation impossible. Here, the Rus had to unload their ships, haul them overland around the rapids, reload, and continue, all while vulnerable to attacks from the nomadic Pecheneg tribes who controlled the surrounding steppes. Byzantine sources describe these Rus merchants with a mixture of fascination and disdain. They were seen as crude barbarians, but their goods were valuable and trade with them was profitable. The Rus established a trading settlement outside Constantinople's walls where they could stay during the trading season. Treaties between the Rus and Byzantium, recorded in both Russian and Byzantine sources, regulated this trade, specifying how many ships could visit, where the Rus could stay, what goods could be exchanged. Not all interactions were peaceful. The Rus launched several military expeditions against Constantinople. In 907, Oleg supposedly led a fleet of 2,000 ships against the city, though the number is almost certainly exaggerated. The Byzantines deployed Greek fire, their famous naval weapon, a napalm-like substance that burned on water, causing heavy Rus casualties. But Oleg still extracted a favorable trade treaty and substantial tribute. In 941, Prince Igor of Kiev led another attack on Constantinople. This raid was less successful, with Byzantine defenses proving more effective. But these military expeditions, even when they failed, demonstrated Rus power and secured advantageous trading terms. Gradually, the Rus became more than just traders. They integrated into the Byzantine military system. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army, was initially composed primarily of Rus warriors. These were mercenaries who served the Byzantine emperor as bodyguards and shock troops. The Varangian Guard became famous for their loyalty and ferocity in battle. Serving in the Guard was prestigious and lucrative. Warriors returned home wealthy, carrying Byzantine gold and goods. Harald Hardrada, who we'll encounter later as one of the last great Viking warriors, served in the Varangian Guard in the early 11th century. He fought for the Byzantines in the Mediterranean and Middle East, gaining wealth and military experience before returning to Scandinavia to pursue his claim to the Norwegian throne. The Volga trade route connected to even more distant markets. Following the Volga southeast led to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic Caliphate. The Rus traded with the Bulgars, a Turkic people who controlled the Middle Volga, and through them accessed the vast markets of the Islamic world. An Arab traveler and diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered Rus traders on the Volga in 922. His account is one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of the Vikings we possess. Ibn Fadlan describes them as tall and blond, perfect physical specimens. He details their hygiene practices, which he finds revolting. They wash communally in basins of water that he considers disgusting, though ironically, Vikings were generally cleaner than most medieval Europeans. More famously, Ibn Fadlan witnessed and described in detail a Rush chieftain's funeral. It was an elaborate ceremony lasting 10 days. The chieftain was placed in his ship along with weapons, food, animals, and a slave girl who was ritually sacrificed to accompany him in death. The entire ship was then burned in a massive pyre. Ibn Fadlan's account, though filtered through his Islamic perspective and obvious cultural biases, provides invaluable details about Rus customs and beliefs. The eastern trade routes brought massive quantities of silver into Scandinavia. Hoards of Arabic silver coins, called dirhams, have been found throughout Sweden and other parts of Scandinavia, sometimes containing thousands of coins. These hoards are our best archaeological evidence for the scale and wealth of the eastern trade. Some silver was melted down and made into jewelry or other objects. Some was buried for safekeeping and never recovered, which is why archaeologists keep finding these hoards over 1,000 years later. The Rus gradually evolved into something neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Slavic but a hybrid culture. They adopted Slavic language, though their ruling class retained Scandinavian names and some cultural practices for generations. They intermarried extensively with Slavic populations. They converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988 when Prince Vladimir of Kiev was baptized, bringing his realm into the Christian world and aligning politically with Byzantium. This conversion was a political calculation as much as a spiritual one. Christianity brought prestige and legitimacy in the eyes of other European powers. It provided literate clergy who could administer a growing state. It connected Kiev to the broader Christian world. But it also meant abandoning the old Norse gods, a transition that wasn't always smooth or complete. The Principality of Kiev, Kievan Ruth as historians call it, became a major medieval power. At its height in the 11th and early 12th centuries, it controlled vast territories, commanded substantial military forces, and was integrated into European diplomatic and dynastic networks. Rus princesses married into European royal families. Kiev itself became a major city, boasting impressive churches and palaces, a far cry from the trading post it had begun as. But the Scandinavian origins were never entirely forgotten. Even as the Rus became Slavic in language and culture, chronicles preserved memory of their Viking ancestors. The very name Russia derives from Rus, the term used for these Scandinavian adventurers. Thus one of the world's largest countries traces its name back to Swedish Vikings who rode and portaged their way down river routes over 1,000 years ago. The eastern expansion of the Vikings was less dramatic in many ways than the western rates. There was no single event like Lindisfarne to mark a beginning. The establishment of trading posts and settlements was gradual. But in terms of lasting historical impact, the eastern Vikings arguably achieved more than their western counterparts. They helped found states that still exist, influenced languages and cultures across a vast region, and created trade networks connecting the Baltic to the Mediterranean and beyond. What motivated these men to row upstream into unknown territory, to portage ships over hostile land, to venture thousands of kilometers from home? The same forces that drove the Western raiders: ambition, desire for wealth, a culture that celebrated courage and exploration, and the technological capability to undertake such journeys. The Eastern Vikings were merchants and mercenaries as much as raiders, but they were no less daring than those who struck westward. The river routes they pioneered remained important for centuries. Some of these routes are still significant today, though now cargo moves by rail and road rather than in shallow draft Viking ships. But for 2 or 3 centuries, these waterways were highways of a commercial empire built by Swedish adventurers, an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Bosporus, from the frozen forests of the north to the sun-baked shores of the Caspian Sea. While some Vikings pressed eastward into Russia and some raided the coasts of Britain and France, others looked westward across the North Atlantic, into waters that grew increasingly empty and forbidding the further one traveled. This westward expansion led to the discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately the first European contact with North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. The settlement of Iceland began in the late 9th century, around 874 according to tradition, though Norse explorers had likely visited earlier. Iceland was uninhabited by humans when the first settlers arrived, though it did have a small population of Irish monks, Paper and Old Norse, who had come seeking isolation for religious contemplation. These monks left when the Norsemen arrived, and Iceland became a purely Scandinavian colony. Why leave Scandinavia for a remote volcanic island in the North Atlantic? The sagas provide various motivations for individual settlers. Some were fleeing political conflicts or the consolidation of royal power in Norway under King Harald Fairhair, who was bringing the various petty kingdoms under his unified rule. Those who refused to submit saw Iceland as a place where they could maintain their independence. Others were younger sons who wouldn't inherit in Scandinavia, looking for land where they could establish their own farms. Iceland had abundant grazing land and seemingly limitless space. A man could claim as much land as he could walk around in a day, lighting bonfires at intervals to mark his boundaries. In land-scarce Scandinavia, this was an extraordinary opportunity. The journey to Iceland from Norway took about a week with favorable winds, crossing open ocean in vessels that offered no shelter and minimal protection from the elements. Settlers brought livestock, tools, timber. Iceland had few trees, and household goods. Entire extended families made the journey, including children, elderly family members, thralls, and all the possessions they could carry. The initial settlement period, the Landnam, saw thousands of people migrate to Iceland over several decades. The Book of Settlements, a medieval Icelandic text, names over 400 original settlers and describes the lands they claimed. These families established farms, primarily sheep and cattle operations suited to Iceland's climate. They built turf houses, low structures with thick earthen walls covered in sod, designed to withstand Iceland's fierce winds. Iceland developed a unique society. With no native population to subjugate and no king claiming sovereignty, the settlers created something unusual in medieval Europe, a commonwealth based on law rather than royal authority. The Althing, established in 930 at Ingvellir, was a general assembly where free men gathered each summer to make laws, settle disputes, and conduct the business of governance. The Althing wasn't a modern democracy, but it was remarkably egalitarian for its time. Major decisions required consensus among the Gore, the local chieftains who held religious and judicial authority. These chieftains were chosen and could theoretically be unchosen by free farmers, creating a system where leadership depended partly on the consent of the governed. Iceland became a center of literary production. It was here, in the 12th and 13th centuries, that the great sagas were written down, prose narratives telling the stories of settlement, family feuds, heroes, and legends. These sagas are among the masterpieces of medieval literature, renowned for their psychological complexity, spare prose style, and unflinching portrayal of human nature. But Iceland was merely the first step westward. In the late 10th century, a man named Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for killings in a blood feud, sailed west to explore reports of land spotted in that direction. He found a massive island largely covered in ice, but with fjords and coastal regions where livestock could graze at least in summer. Eric returned to Iceland after his exile period ended and recruited settlers for this new land. In a brilliant piece of marketing, he called it Greenland, a name calculated to attract colonists. Whether this was deliberate exaggeration or whether the climate was genuinely milder in that period is debated. The medieval warm period may have made Greenland's coastal regions more habitable than they would be later. In 985 or 986, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships carrying several hundred settlers to Greenland. About 14 ships arrived, the others turned back or were lost at sea. These survivors established settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast, in areas they called the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, though both were on the island's western coast from a modern geographic perspective. Greenland was more marginal than Iceland. The growing season was shorter, the land less productive. But there were resources that made settlement viable. The waters teemed with fish and seals. Walrus ivory, highly prized in Europe, could be obtained. Polar bear skins and live polar bears, exotic luxuries for European nobility, were valuable export goods. The Greenland settlements persisted for centuries. At their peak, they may have had 5,000 inhabitants. They built churches, maintained contact with Iceland and Norway, paid tithes to the Catholic Church, and even had a bishop appointed to minister to these most remote of medieval Christians. But Greenland was never self-sufficient. The settlers had to import grain, iron, timber, and other essentials. They depended on trade with Europe, and when that trade became irregular or ceased, as it gradually did in the late Middle Ages, the settlements couldn't survive. By the mid-15th century, the Greenland settlements were abandoned, though whether the inhabitants died out, were absorbed by the Inuit, or managed to evacuate is still debated. It was from Greenland that the Norse made their most remarkable journey, to North America. According to the sagas, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, heard reports from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson who had been blown off course and spotted land west of Greenland. Around the year 1000, Leif organized an expedition to investigate. Leif and his crew sailed west from Greenland until they reached land. They explored the coast, finding a place they called Vinland, literally wineland or possibly meadowland depending on how one interprets the Old Norse. The sagas describe a rich territory with salmon larger than any they had seen, grasslands for grazing, and timber, precious timber, which was scarce in Greenland. The sagas tell of subsequent expeditions to Vinland, attempts to establish settlements, encounters with indigenous peoples whom the Norse called skrælings, a contemptuous term that translates roughly as wretches or barbarians. These encounters were sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. In one account, indigenous people arrived in boats to trade. But tensions escalated, possibly due to misunderstandings or Norse aggression. Fighting broke out. The Norse had superior weapons, but the indigenous peoples had numbers and knowledge of the terrain. The saga accounts suggest that the Norse made several attempts to settle in Vinland but ultimately abandoned the effort. The distance from Greenland was great, supply lines tenuous, and the indigenous population too numerous and too hostile. Unlike in Iceland or even Greenland, the Norse weren't arriving in empty or nearly empty territory. North America was inhabited by peoples who had been there for millennia and who were not inclined to welcome invaders. For a long time, these saga accounts were dismissed as legend or exaggeration. But in 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist and Stein Ingstad, discovered unambiguous evidence of Norse presence in North America at Lance Aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland. The site contains the remains of 8 buildings, clearly Norse in style, dated to approximately 1000 CE, exactly matching the saga chronology. Lance Aux Meadows wasn't a large settlement. It appears to have been a temporary base, perhaps used for 1 or 2 winters before being abandoned. It may not have been the main settlement described in the sagas, or might have been one of several bases established during the Vinland expeditions. But its existence proves conclusively that the Norse reached North America around the year 1000, half a millennium before Columbus. Why did the Norse settlement of North America fail when other Norse Atlantic ventures succeeded? Several factors seem crucial. Distance was one. Iceland was about a week's sail from Norway. Greenland was about another week beyond Iceland. Vinland was yet another week or more beyond Greenland. That's 3 weeks of ocean sailing, assuming favorable conditions, to reach the nearest parts of North America from Europe. Maintaining a settlement at such a distance, supplying it, reinforcing it with new settlers, all this was extraordinarily difficult even for the Vikings. The indigenous population was another critical factor. Iceland was uninhabited. Greenland had no permanent human population when the Norse arrived, though Inuit peoples migrated there later and may have had contacts with Norse settlers. But North America was extensively populated. The peoples living there, probably ancestors of modern Beothuk or other First Nations groups, had no reason to tolerate Norse intrusion and every reason to resist it. The Norse had technological advantages in some areas: iron weapons and tools, possibly armor, experience with organized warfare. But the indigenous peoples had overwhelming numerical superiority, intimate knowledge of the territory, and their own sophisticated technologies perfectly adapted to the environment. The sagas describe conflicts where Norse parties were driven off or forced to retreat. Sustained settlement would have required constant military vigilance and periodic reinforcement from Greenland, which itself was a marginal colony barely surviving. Economics played a role too. What could Vinland offer that would justify the enormous effort and risk of settlement? Timber, certainly, which was valuable in treeless Greenland. But it's easier to sail to Canada, cut timber, and return to Greenland than to maintain a permanent colony for timber harvest. There were no obvious wealth sources equivalent to the walrus ivory that made Greenland economically viable. The Norse were primarily interested in trade goods for European markets, and Vinland didn't seem to offer anything that couldn't be obtained more easily elsewhere. Climate may have been a factor as well. The medieval warm period that facilitated the settlement of Iceland and Greenland was not uniformly warm everywhere. Conditions in northern Newfoundland would still have been challenging. The brief sagas mentions grapes growing, which has caused endless speculation about location, since grapes don't grow in northern Newfoundland. Perhaps the accounts conflict multiple locations, or perhaps Vinland was further south than Lance Aux Meadows. We simply don't know. The failure to colonize America permanently doesn't diminish the achievement. Norse explorers crossed the Atlantic, established settlements in Iceland and Greenland, reached North America, explored its coasts, and attempted settlement, all with 8th century technology and no knowledge of what they would find. The courage this required is staggering. They sailed into unknown waters where no European had gone, thousands of kilometers from home, with no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. These Atlantic voyages represented Viking maritime skill at its apex. Open ocean navigation without compass or sextant, relying on the sun, stars, wave patterns, bird behavior, and seawater temperature changes, required expertise accumulated over generations. The sunshadow board, a primitive instrument that could determine latitude, may have been used. The sunstone, possibly calcite or cordierite crystals that can detect polarized light and thus locate the sun even through clouds, may have aided navigation, though evidence is debated. The Nara, the cargo ship variant of Viking vessels, was crucial for Atlantic colonization. Unlike longships optimized for raiding, Nars were built for cargo capacity and seaworthiness. They were wider, deeper, more stable in rough seas. They could carry livestock, supplies, and families. The Skaldalef 1 ship, a Nar discovered in Denmark's Roskilde Fjord and dated to around 1040, could carry about 30 tons of cargo and needed only a crew of 6 to 8. This efficiency made long-distance colonization economically feasible. The Atlantic colonies, even the failed attempt at Vinland, had lasting impacts. Iceland became a vital link in North Atlantic navigation and trade. Its literary culture preserved Norse mythology and history. Greenland, though ultimately abandoned, demonstrated the extraordinary reach of Norse expansion. And Vinland, even as a failed experiment, represents a historical road not taken. If Norse colonization of America had succeeded, if the bridgehead had been maintained and expanded, the entire subsequent history of the Americas might have unfolded differently. As it was, the Norse voyages to America were eventually forgotten even in Scandinavia. The sagas were preserved in Iceland but known to few elsewhere. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he had no knowledge of Norse precedent. The Viking discovery of America was a dead end historically, remarkable but leading nowhere in terms of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. Yet modern DNA studies suggest Norse genes may persist in some Native American populations, hinting at interactions we can only guess at. And the archaeology continues. Possible Norse artifacts have been found elsewhere in North America, though most remain disputed. Perhaps other sites exist, waiting to be discovered, that would fill in our picture of Norse America. What remains indisputable is that between the late 9th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavian seafarers explored and colonized a chain of islands across the North Atlantic, pushed further west than any previous Europeans, and briefly established a presence in the Americas. This expansion demonstrated the Vikings' most remarkable characteristic: their sheer audacity, their willingness to sail into the unknown in pursuit of land, wealth, and glory. Beyond the raids and explorations, beyond the battles and voyages, Vikings were people living daily lives in a society with its own structures, customs, and complexities. Understanding Viking civilization requires looking beyond the longships and access to the farms and villages where most Vikings spent most of their lives. Viking society was stratified into 3 main classes, each with distinct rights and roles. At the top were the jarls, the aristocracy. These were the wealthy landowners, the chieftains who commanded loyalty and led expeditions. A jarl's wealth was measured in land, livestock, ships, and followers. They lived in large longhouses, wore fine clothes, owned precious objects, and held feasts where they distributed gifts to their followers, reinforcing bonds of loyalty. The relationship between a jarl and his men was reciprocal. The jarl provided protection, led profitable ventures, and shared wealth. In return, men swore loyalty, offered military service, and supported the jarl in disputes and power struggles. This was a personal relationship, not an abstract allegiance to a state or institution. Men followed a specific leader whom they knew and who knew them. Below the jarls were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the bulk of Viking society. A carl owned his own land or applied to trade independently. He had rights under law. He could participate in the thing, the assembly where free men gathered to make decisions and settle disputes. He could bear arms, own property, enter contracts, and seek justice for wrongs done to him or his family. Being a carl meant independence and dignity. A free farmer, even if not wealthy, commanded respect. His household was his domain. He made decisions about his farm's operation, about his children's futures, about participating in ventures beyond the farm. This freedom was valued intensely. To lose freedom, to become a thrall, was a profound degradation. At the bottom were the thralls, the enslaved people who had no freedom and minimal rights. Thralls were property bought and sold like livestock. They performed the heavy, unpleasant labor, clearing land, hauling timber, working in the marshes, tending animals. Female thralls served as household servants and were sexually available to their owners. How did people become thralls? Some were born into slavery, children of thrall mothers. Others were captured in raids or warfare. Kidnapping for the slave trade was a component of Viking raiding. Debt slavery existed too. People unable to pay debts might become thralls of their creditors. Though uncommon, some people apparently sold themselves into slavery to escape starvation. The thrall's life was hard. They had no right to refuse work, no right to property, no legal protection against mistreatment. An owner could beat or even kill a thrall with minimal legal consequences. Yet practices varied. Some owners treated thralls relatively well, and a thrall who served loyally might eventually be freed. Freed slaves, freedmen, occupied an intermediate status, free but not fully equal to those born free. The proportion of thralls in Viking society is debated. Estimates range from 10 to 30% of the population. Whatever the precise number, slavery was integral to the Viking economy. The labor thralls provided freed carls and jarls to engage in trade, warfare, and craftsmanship. The slave trade itself, selling captives to markets in Byzantine and Islamic territories, was a source of wealth. Women in Viking society had a status that was complex and in some ways surprisingly high compared to many medieval cultures. A wife managed the household in her husband's absence, which could be lengthy if he was away trading or raiding. She controlled the keys to storerooms and chests, a symbolic and practical sign of her authority over household resources. Women could own property in their own right, through inheritance or as bride price. If a marriage dissolved, the wife was entitled to her property and her share of jointly accumulated wealth. Divorce was available to both parties, though the grounds and procedures were specific. A woman could initiate divorce for reasons including her husband's physical abuse, his failure to provide, or even if he wore clothing considered inappropriately feminine, a serious issue in this hypermasculine culture. Female infanticide, particularly of daughters, may have been practiced, though evidence is ambiguous. The preference for sons was strong in a society that valued martial prowess. But many families clearly valued daughters too, as evident in loving father-daughter relationships depicted in sagas and runestones dedicated by fathers to deceased daughters. Some women were seeresses, vulvas, who practiced seer, a form of magic involving prophecy and spirit communication. These women held respected positions, consulted about futures, outcomes of ventures, fates of individuals. The sagas describe elaborate ceremonies where a vulva would perform her rituals, entering trances to communicate with supernatural forces. The question of female warriors is contentious. The sagas mention shield maidens, women who fought alongside men. For centuries, scholars dismissed these as pure legend. But recent analysis of burials previously assumed to be male warriors has revealed some were women, buried with weapons and martial accoutrements. The Burka warrior woman, discovered in Sweden and reanalyzed using DNA in 2017, is the most famous example. Does this mean Viking armies routinely included female warriors? Probably not in large numbers. But it suggests that some women did take up arms, perhaps when defending homesteads in men's absence, perhaps as exceptional individuals who defied gender norms, perhaps in ritual or ceremonial contexts. The truth likely lies somewhere between complete absence and the warrior women hordes of popular imagination. Children in Viking society were valued but faced harsh realities. Infant mortality was high. Disease, accidents, and the general dangers of life claimed many children before adulthood. But those who survived childhood were gradually integrated into adult society, learning skills through apprenticeship and observation. Boys learned farming, hunting, fishing, and fighting from fathers and other men. They practiced with wooden weapons, learned to row, to care for animals, to work metal or wood depending on family occupation. Girls learned textile production, food preparation and preservation, household management, herbalism, and healing from mothers and other women. But the division wasn't absolute. Everyone needed basic competence in multiple areas. Fosterage was common among elite families. A child would be sent to be raised by another family, creating bonds between households. The foster parents were responsible for the child's education and upbringing, and the relationships formed could be as strong as blood kinship. Fosterage created networks of obligation and alliance that persisted throughout life. The thing was the foundation of Viking governance. This assembly of free men met at regular intervals, typically annually at established locations. The thing served multiple functions: legislative, judicial, social. Laws were recited aloud by a law speaker who had memorized them, ensuring everyone knew the rules. Disputes were brought before the assembly for judgment. Major decisions affecting the community were debated and decided. The thing was a majority-rule democracy. Consensus was sought, But influential men, the jarls and successful warriors, carried more weight. Still, the principle that law came from the assembly of free men rather than from a king's decree was fundamental. Iceland's Althing, established in 930, is the most famous example, but things operated throughout Scandinavia and wherever Norse peoples settled. Justice was often handled through wergild, compensation payments for wrongs. If someone was killed, the killer or his family owed payment to the victim's family based on the victim's status. This system aimed to prevent endless blood feuds by providing a mechanism for settling disputes without further violence. But it didn't always work. If compensation wasn't paid or was deemed insufficient, feuds could continue for generations. Outlawry was the ultimate punishment. A person declared outlaw lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty. An outlaw couldn't own property, couldn't participate in the thing, couldn't expect hospitality. For someone in Viking society, this was social death. Some outlaws fled to remote areas or to other countries, like Eric the Red, who went to Greenland after being outlawed in Iceland. Daily life for a Jarl family revolved around agricultural and pastoral work. Men plowed fields using ard plows pulled by oxen, a technology that was less efficient than later moldboard plows but adequate for the light soils of Scandinavia. They sowed barley, rye, oats, and some wheat. They harvested hay for winter livestock feed. They fished, hunted, and gathered wild resources. Women spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth on upright looms, sewed garments, prepared and preserved food. Food preservation was critical for surviving winter. Fish was dried, smoked, or salted. Meat was similarly preserved. Milk was made into cheese and butter that would keep for months. Cabbage and other vegetables were stored in root cellars. Berries were preserved in honey or simply dried. The longhouse was the center of domestic life. These structures, anywhere from 15 to 75 meters long depending on the family's wealth, were built of timber where available, turf and stone where timber was scarce. The interior was typically divided into sections. A central hearth provided heat and light. Benches along the walls served as seating during the day and beds at night. The family's most valuable possessions, weapons, jewelry, fine cloth, were stored in locked chests. Lighting came from whale oil lamps or fish oil lamps, simple bowls with a wick. Fire was precious and carefully maintained. Letting the fire go out was considered careless or unlucky. Households kept embers burning continuously, banking fires at night and rekindling them in the morning. Meals were communal. The family ate together, often from shared bowls. Food was placed in the center and people took what they needed. Meat, when available, was boiled in cauldrons or roasted over the fire. Bread was flatbread cooked on stones or griddles. Porridge from grain was a staple. Beer and mead were preferred drinks, safer than water which could be contaminated. Personal hygiene was actually quite good by medieval standards. Archaeological evidence includes combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, indicating people cared about cleanliness and grooming. Men maintained their beards, braiding them or keeping them trimmed. Women wore their hair long, often braided elaborately. Bathing in streams or heated bathhouses was common, at least in summer. Clothing was practical and layered. Men wore linen or wool tunics over trousers with leg wrappings and leather shoes. A cloak fastened with a brooch provided warmth. Women wore long linen shifts under wool dresses, typically suspended by shoulder straps fastened with distinctive oval brooches. Cloaks, shawls, and head coverings completed the outfit. The wealthy could afford fine fabrics, silk imported from the East, richly dyed wool. Colors were achieved through natural dyes: yellow from various plants, red from madder root, blue from woad, brown from walnut husks. The very wealthy might have garments trimmed with fur, silver thread, or imported brocades. Jewelry was important for both sexes. It displayed wealth, served as portable treasure, and had social meanings. Women wore necklaces, bracelets, and the distinctive paired oval brooches. Men wore arm rings, often given by jarls as rewards, and finger rings. Thor's hammers, small pendants shaped like the god Thor's mythical hammer, were popular religious symbols. Entertainment during long winter nights included storytelling, poetry, music, and games. The skald, the poet, held an honored position. Skalds composed verses in complex meters, celebrating heroes, recording history, or mocking enemies. Memorizing and reciting poetry was a valued skill. The ability to compose clever verses on the spot was even more admired. Music came from instruments including lyres, bone flutes, and drums. Dancing was part of celebrations and festivals. Board games, particularly Nefadafall, a strategy game where one player defends a king piece against numerical superior forces, provided intellectual challenge. Dice games and physical contests, wrestling and stone lifting, tested strength and skill. Feasting was central to social life. A Jarl held feasts to reward followers, celebrate victories, mark seasonal festivals. These could last days with enormous quantities of meat, bread, and especially drink consumed. Mead, made from fermented honey, and beer, brewed from grain, flowed freely. Drunkenness was expected, even celebrated. These occasions reinforced social bonds, provided opportunities to negotiate alliances, and allowed the Jarl to display his wealth and generosity. Religious festivals marked the year. Midwinter, around the solstice, was a major celebration, later Christianized as Yule and evolving into Christmas. Spring festivals celebrated planting, sought blessings for crops. Autumn festivals celebrated harvest. These occasions involved feasting, drinking, and animal sacrifices to the gods, seeking their favor and protection. Family honor was paramount. An insult to one family member was an insult to all. Avenging wrongs was a duty, not optional. This code of honor drove many of the conflicts in Viking society. A man who failed to avenge an insult or injury to his family was shamed, his reputation destroyed. This could lead to feuds that spanned generations, with killings and retaliation creating cycles of violence. Yet Vikings also valued cleverness and compromise. The sagas praise characters who use wit to solve problems, who negotiate settlements that avoid unnecessary bloodshed, who understand when to fight and when to seek peace. The culture was not mindlessly violent, even if it did celebrate martial prowess. Marriage was primarily a social and economic arrangement. Families negotiated matches, considering property, status, and alliances. Love might develop, and the sagas certainly depict passionate relationships, but practical considerations were paramount. The bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, and the dowry, property the bride brought to the marriage, were carefully negotiated. Polygamy may have existed among the wealthy, though it wasn't widespread. More common was the practice of concubinage, where a man might have a wife and also a concubine, a woman of lower status with whom he had a recognized relationship. Children from such unions had some rights, though not equal to legitimate children. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. If you survived childhood, you might live to 40 or 50, but many died younger from disease, injury, or violence. Medical knowledge was limited to herbalism, simple surgery, and prayer. Injuries that are treatable today, broken bones, infections, severe cuts, could be fatal. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in labor or from postpartum complications. Despite hardships, or perhaps because of them, Viking society developed strong communal bonds. Neighbors helped each other at harvest and building projects in times of crisis. Gift-giving created obligations of reciprocity. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Turning away a traveler seeking shelter was shameful. These social customs provided a safety net in a world without formal institutions of charity or welfare. The Viking world, seen from within, was structured and ordered, governed by laws and customs, bound by obligations of kinship and loyalty. The violence that shocked Christian Europe was, from a Viking perspective, simply part of life, not meaningfully different from the violence Christians inflicted on each other in their endless wars and conflicts. Vikings viewed themselves as honorable people living according to their own code, worshipping their own gods, building their own civilization in a harsh land. That this civilization expressed itself through raiding wealthier neighbors was, to them, simply practical. The physical artifacts Vikings left behind, ships, weapons, jewelry, tools, reveal a people of remarkable technical skill and artistic sensibility. Viking craftsmanship wasn't just functional. It was an art form, with even everyday objects displaying careful attention to design and decoration. Shipbuilding was perhaps the highest expression of Viking technical prowess. We've discussed ships in terms of their strategic importance, but the actual construction process deserves closer attention because it exemplifies Viking craftsmanship at its finest. The process began with selecting trees. Shipbuilders sought old-growth oaks with straight grain and minimal defects. A single large ship might require timber from dozens of trees. The trees weren't sawn, they were split using wedges. This labor-intensive method followed the wood's natural grain structure, producing planks that were stronger than sawn lumber because the fibers weren't cut across. The keel, the ship's backbone, was carved from a single massive oak timber. It had to be perfectly straight, and its dimensions were critical because they determined the ship's entire size and proportions. Shaping the keel required precision and enormous effort, using axes and adzes to work the massive piece of wood into the required form. The stems, the curved pieces at bow and stern, were carved from naturally curved timber. Finding trees with the right curve in the right place was part of the shipbuilder's expertise. These stems were fitted to the keel and secured with massive iron nails whose points were driven through and then hammered over washers on the inside to clinch them permanently. Then came the hull planks, the strakes. These overlapped like shingles, each fastened to the one below with iron rivets. The rivets were driven through the overlapping planks, and the ends were hammered over rows, small square washers that spread the load and prevented the rivet from pulling through. This clinker construction created a hull that was strong yet flexible, able to twist slightly with wave action rather than fighting it. The planks were shaped by heating them, making the wood pliable enough to bend into the required curves. This required understanding of wood properties, fire control, and timing. Too much heat would char the wood. Too little wouldn't make it pliable enough. It was a skill learned through years of apprenticeship and practice. Once the shell of the hull was complete to a certain height, internal frames were added. These weren't structural in the same sense as in later ship construction. The planking itself provided the primary strength, but the frames added rigidity and provided attachment points for the deck beams and rowing benches. The frames were attached to the hull using lashing, running through cleats carved into the frames and planking, creating a connection that was strong but still allowed some flex. The mast step, a massive wooden block set into the keel, held the base of the mast. The mast itself might be 15 to 20 meters tall, a single tree trunk carefully shaped. It had to be strong enough to support a huge sail in high winds, yet light enough not to destabilize the ship. A mast that broke in a storm could be catastrophic. The sail was a marvel of textile production. A single large sail might measure 100 square meters or more. This required hundreds of kilograms of wool, which had to be shorn, cleaned, carded, spun into yarn, and then woven on looms. The weaving alone took months of labor, typically done by women. The finished cloth was densely woven and often treated with fat to make it water-resistant. Sails were typically striped in red and white or natural wool colors, creating geometric patterns. These weren't just decorative. Each ship's sail had distinctive patterns that identified it from a distance. Rigging the sail required complex networks of ropes, blocks, and stays. The Vikings developed sophisticated rigging systems that allowed them to adjust the sail to different wind conditions, to reef it in high winds, or to strike it entirely and rely on or power. Weaponry was another area of extraordinary craftsmanship. Viking swords weren't crude clubs. They were sophisticated cutting weapons made by skilled smiths using pattern welding techniques that produced blades of remarkable quality and beauty. Pattern welding involved forge welding together multiple strips of iron and steel with different carbon contents, twisting them, and then hammering them into a blade core. This created a blade that was hard enough to hold an edge but resilient enough not to shatter on impact. The process created distinctive patterns in the metal, rippling lines that were considered beautiful as well as evidence of quality. The edge itself was made from harder steel, welded onto the pattern-welded core. This edge could be ground to extreme sharpness. A Viking sword in skilled hands could cut through flesh, bone, and even mail armor. But these swords were expensive, requiring days or weeks of a smith's time and considerable skill. They were prestige objects as much as weapons, often given names passed down through families, mentioned in sagas. Axes were more common. Every free man owned an axe, if only for utilitarian purposes. But fighting axes were specialized tools, carefully balanced, with edges ground to lethal sharpness. The broad axe, sometimes called the Danish axe, had a wide, curved blade that could deliver devastating cuts. In skilled hands, an axe could split a shield or cleave a helmet. Spears were the most common weapon for warfare. They were cheaper to produce than swords, effective in formation fighting, and versatile, serving as both thrusting and throwing weapons. Spearheads were socketed, slipping over a wooden shaft and secured with rivets. The best spearheads, like the best swords, showed elaborate patterns from pattern welding and careful forging. Archery was practiced, though bows were less prominent in Viking warfare than in some other cultures. The composite bow, the powerful recurved design used by steppe nomads, wasn't used. Vikings used longbows made from single pieces of yew or elm. These were effective for hunting and in naval combat but less emphasized in land battle where close combat dominated. Armor varied with wealth. The richest warriors wore mail shirts, byrnie and Old Norse, made of thousands of interlocking iron rings. Creating a mail shirt required months of labor, individually making and connecting tens of thousands of rings. Mail provided excellent protection against cuts while allowing freedom of movement. But it was expensive and heavy, worn only by those who could afford it. Most warriors relied on padded garments, thick layers of cloth that provided some protection while being much cheaper. Leather armor may have been used, though evidence is sparse. Shields were universal, round shields about a meter in diameter made of wood, typically linden or fir, covered in leather and with an iron boss in the center to protect the hand. The shield was both defensive tool and weapon, used to push opponents, strike, and create openings for spear or sword. Helmets were simpler than popular imagination suggests. The famous horned helmet is a myth, invented by 19th century artists. Real Viking helmets were conical or rounded iron caps, sometimes with nose guards designed to deflect blows. Even helmets were expensive enough that not everyone owned one. Many warriors fought with only a leather cap or even bareheaded. Metalworking extended beyond weapons to jewelry and decorative objects. Viking metalworkers created intricate brooches, arm rings, pendants, and other ornaments using various techniques. Cast bronze jewelry was common, made using the lost wax process where a wax model was encased in clay, the wax melted out, and molten bronze poured into the cavity. Silver was preferred for high-status jewelry. Silver arm rings were both ornaments and a form of currency. They could be cut into pieces, hack silver, to make payments. The weight of silver determined value, so accuracy in weighing was important. Small folding balance scales have been found in Viking graves, used by traders to weigh silver. Gold was rarer and more valuable. Gold jewelry was typically reserved for the very wealthy. The craftsmanship on surviving gold pieces is extraordinary, with intricate filigree work, granulation, tiny gold beads soldered to a surface, and complex geometric or animal designs. The art style evolved over the Viking Age. Early Viking art featured complex interlaced animal designs, creatures biting, gripping, and entangling each other in dense patterns that covered available surfaces. The Oseberg ship, from the early 9th century, displays this style at its finest in its carved wooden posts and other decorations. Later styles became somewhat more simplified and abstract. The gelling style, named after the Danish royal site, featured ribbon-like animals. The mammoth style introduced elements of plant motifs along with animals. By the late Viking Age, the inn style featured slender, elegant interlacing designs with more open compositions. These weren't random artistic evolution. They reflect changing tastes, influence from other cultures, and the creativity of individual craftsmen. The best pieces show remarkable artistry, complex designs executed with technical precision that's impressive even by modern standards. Woodworking was fundamental. Beyond ships, Vikings created buildings, furniture, tools, containers, and decorative objects from wood. The carpenter's tools were simple. Axes, adzes, augers for drilling, knives, wedges, but in skilled hands, these tools could create everything from massive longhouses to delicate wooden bowls. Some wooden objects were decorated with elaborate carvings. The Oseberg ship burial included sleds, wagons, and other objects covered in intricate carvings. The Viking tendency to decorate functional objects with art speaks to an aesthetic sensibility that found beauty in everyday things. Textile production was labor-intensive and essential. Clothing, sails, blankets, storage bags, all required vast quantities of cloth. Women spent countless hours processing wool and flax. Sheep were sheared in spring. The wool was cleaned, carded to align the fibers, and then spun into yarn using a drop spindle, a weight attached to a shaft that provided momentum as the spinner drew out fibers and twisted them. Spinning was done whenever there was spare time, while watching children, while socializing, during travel. A skilled spinner could produce remarkable quantities of yarn, but it still took an estimated 200 hours of spinning to produce enough yarn for a single piece of sailcloth measuring 2 by 2 meters. Weaving was done on upright looms, large frames with warp threads hanging vertically, weighted with clay or stone loom weights. The weaver passed weft threads horizontally through the warp, creating cloth. Different patterns could be created through different weaving techniques: plain weave, twill, complex patterns. Weaving with skilled work, and the quality of cloth varied considerably with the weaver's expertise. Dyes created colors from natural materials. The processes were complex, often involving mordants to fix the dye to the fabric. Some colors were easier to achieve than others. Blue from woad was relatively common. Red from madder root was more expensive. Purple dyes were extremely costly, as precious in their way as precious metals. A person's clothing color could signal status and wealth. Embroidery added decoration to fine garments. The Bayeux tapestry, though created slightly after the Viking Age and depicting the Norman conquest of England, shows the kind of elaborate embroidery that wealthy Anglo-Saxons and likely Vikings used to decorate clothing and hangings. Leatherworking provided shoes, belts, bags, scabbards, and many other items. Leather was tanned using various methods: typically involving tree bark that provided tannins to preserve and strengthen the hide. Skilled leatherworkers could create fine, supple leather or thick, rigid leather depending on the intended use. Pottery was relatively crude in Scandinavia itself. Vikings used more wooden and metal vessels than pottery. But in areas Vikings settled, they adopted local pottery traditions or imported pottery from more advanced ceramic-producing regions. Glass beads were valued ornaments, often imported from continental Europe or the Middle East, though some evidence suggests glass bead production in Scandinavia itself. The bright colors and shine of glass beads made them popular for necklaces and as decorative elements on clothing. The overall impression from studying Viking craftsmanship is of a people who combined practical necessity with aesthetic sensibility. Objects were made to work, to last, to serve their purposes. But they were also made to be beautiful, to display the skill of the maker, to give pleasure to user and observer. This integration of function and art characterized Viking material culture. Moreover, the level of skill required in various crafts means Viking society included specialized craftsmen who spent years learning their trades. A master shipbuilder, a skilled smith, an expert weaver, these weren't people who simply picked up a tool and worked. They were highly trained specialists whose expertise was valuable and respected. Trade networks distributed these goods. A sword made in the Rhineland might end up in a Norwegian grave. Glass beads from the Near East, silk from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from Greenland, all these moved along trade routes connecting Scandinavia to the wider medieval world. Vikings were participants in long-distance commerce, selling their products. Furs, fish, slaves, walrus ivory, and buying luxury goods, silver, fine weapons, cloth. This commercial side of Viking culture is often overshadowed by the raiding, but it was equally important. The same ships that carried raiders carried merchants. Many expeditions combined both. Trade where possible, raid where opportunities presented. The distinction between trader and raider wasn't always clear-cut. The physical legacy of Viking craftsmanship survives in museums across Scandinavia and Europe. The ships, weapons, jewelry, tools speak to us across a millennium, evidence of human skill, creativity, and the desire to make things that work well and look beautiful. They remind us that Vikings were not merely warriors but craftspeople, artists, builders who created a material culture of remarkable sophistication and enduring beauty. Viking religion was the framework through which they understood existence, a polytheistic system featuring a complex pantheon of gods, a cosmology of 9 interconnected worlds, and a belief system that influenced everything from daily decisions to the conduct of warfare. At the center of Norse cosmology stood Yggdrasil, the world tree. This immense ash tree connected the 9 worlds, its roots reaching down to the underworld realms, its trunk supporting the worlds of gods and humans, its branches extending into the heavens. Yggdrasil wasn't just a mythological concept. It was the physical and spiritual structure of reality itself. The 9 worlds were arranged in 3 levels. In the heights dwelt Asgard, home of the Aesir, the principal gods. Here stood Valhalla, Odin's great hall where fallen warriors feasted. Nearby was Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, a second tribe of gods associated with fertility and prosperity. Alfheim was the realm of the light elves, beautiful and benevolent creatures. On the middle level sat Midgard, the world of humans, surrounded by a great ocean. Connected to it were Jotunheim, land of the giants, beings often hostile to gods and humans, and Svartalfheim, realm of the dark elves or dwarfs, master craftsmen who dwelt underground. The lower realms included Niflheim, a frozen wasteland of ice and snow, and Muspelheim, a burning realm of fire. Between them, in darkness, lay Helheim, the land of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel. Most who died went to Helheim, a shadowy existence neither particularly pleasant nor torturous, simply a continuation in dimness. The structure wasn't static. 3 roots of Yggdrasil extended to different realms. One reached to Asgard, where the gods held council beside the well of Ord. One extended to Jotunheim, where the well of Mimir held wisdom. The third reached to Nibelheim, where the spring of Hergelmir fed the rivers of the world. Various creatures inhabited Yggdrasil. 4 stags fed on its leaves. A great serpent, Nidhogg, gnawed at the roots. An eagle perched in its highest branches, with a hawk named Vurthlundur sitting between its eyes. A squirrel, Ratatoskr, ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults between the eagle above and the serpent below, embodying the conflict inherent in existence. The gods themselves were neither omnipotent nor immortal. They could be injured, tricked, and would ultimately die at Ragnarok, the final battle. But they were powerful, each associated with specific domains and possessing individual personalities and preferences. Odin, the All-Father, was king of the gods and the most complex figure in the pantheon. He was associated with wisdom, war, poetry, and magic. Odin had sacrificed an eye to drink from Mimir's well, gaining wisdom at the cost of physical completeness. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days, pierced by a spear, to gain knowledge of the runes, the magical writing system. Odin was a seeker of knowledge, often traveling in disguise among humans, testing their hospitality and character. He was unpredictable, sometimes helping heroes, sometimes engineering their downfall according to his own inscrutable purposes. Warriors sought his favor, knowing that while he granted victory, he also demanded death in battle as the price of entering Valhalla. Thor, Odin's son, was perhaps the most popular god among common people. He was the god of thunder, storms, and strength, wielding his mighty hammer Mjolnir, which always returned to his hand after being thrown. Thor was the defender of both gods and humans against the giants. His exploits, often featuring physical strength and straightforward action rather than Odin's cunning, made him a beloved figure. Thor rode in a chariot pulled by 2 goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, which he could slaughter for food and then resurrect. His hammer was a symbol of protection, and small hammer amulets were worn as talismans. Thor's hammer appears in countless archaeological finds, evidence of his widespread veneration. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, but also war and death, was among the most powerful deities. She received half of those who died in battle, bringing them to her hall Sessrumnir in the realm of Folkvanger, with Odin receiving the other half. She possessed a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed transformation, and she rode a chariot pulled by cats. Freya was associated with seer, magic, particularly the shamanic practices of prophecy and spirit communication. Freyr, Freya's brother, was god of fertility, peace, and prosperity. He brought good harvests and was associated with sunshine and rain. His most prized possession was the ship Sklenir, which could be folded small enough to fit in a pocket but expanded to carry all the gods. Tyr was god of war and justice, associated with oaths and law. He sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir, the monstrous wolf prophesied to kill Odin at Ragnarok. Tyr placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth as a pledge of good faith while the gods bound the wolf with magical chains. When Fenrir realized he'd been tricked, he bit off Tyr's hand, but the binding held. Loki occupied a unique position, part god, part giant, associated with trickery, mischief, and chaos. Loki was neither fully ally nor enemy of the gods. He often caused problems through his schemes but also helped solve them with his cleverness. His children were notable: Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world serpent that encircled Midgard, and Hel, ruler of the land of the dead. Loki's ultimate betrayal would precipitate Ragnarok. After causing the death of Baldur, the beloved god, Loki would be bound by the gods as punishment. But at Ragnarok, he would break free and lead the giants against the gods in the final battle. Baldur, son of Odin and Frigg, was the god of light, purity, and beauty. His death was a pivotal mythological event. Frigg extracted oaths from all things not to harm Baldur, but she neglected mistletoe, considering it too small and harmless. Loki discovered this, fashioned a spear of mistletoe, and tricked the blind god Hr into throwing it at Baldur, killing him. The grief over Baldur's death and the god's inability to bring him back from Helheim presaged the coming end of the world. Religious practice in Viking society didn't involve temples in the way Christianity or classical paganism did. Worship was conducted at sacred sites: groves, springs, unusual rock formations. Sacrifices, blot in Old Norse, were the primary religious ritual. Animals, typically horses, cattle, or pigs, were sacrificed to the gods, their blood sprinkled on altars and people, their meat cooked and eaten in a communal feast. Human sacrifice apparently occurred, though how commonly is debated. Arabic sources describe human sacrifices observed at Rus funerals. Archaeological evidence of possible human sacrifices exists, individuals killed and buried in ways suggesting ritual rather than normal burial. But whether this was regular practice or reserved for special circumstances isn't clear. The seeress, the Volva, practiced seer, a form of magic involving trance states and spirit communication. These women, and possibly some men, would be consulted about the future, about the outcomes of planned ventures, about hidden things. The Volva would enter a trance, often sitting on a high platform, and answer questions posed by the community. This was serious business. The seers held real power and respect. Runes were more than just writing. They held magical significance. Each rune represented a sound but also embodied a concept or power. Runes could be carved on objects for protection, to bring good luck, to curse enemies. The runic alphabet, the Futhark, named for its first 6 letters, evolved over time. The elder Futhark had 24 runes, the younger Futhark only 16. Runestones, large stones carved with runic inscriptions, were erected as memorials, typically for deceased family members. These stones often included both practical information, who erected it, for whom and why, and decorative elements. They're valuable historical sources, providing names, relationships, sometimes details of expeditions or deeds. Thousands survive across Scandinavia, each a link to a specific person's memory. Death and the afterlife were complex. Most people went to Helheim, but this wasn't necessarily seen as punishment. It was simply where the dead gathered, a shadowy realm ruled by Hel. Those who died in battle might go to Valhalla, to feast with Odin and train for Ragnarok, or to Freya's hall. Those who drowned might go to the hall of the goddess Ran. The destination depended on how you died and which god claimed you. Ship burials and other elaborate interments for the wealthy suggest belief that the dead took objects to the afterlife. Bodies were buried with weapons, jewelry, tools, food, drink, even ships. The Oseberg ship burial included 2 women, elaborate grave goods, and a ship that had been dragged inland and buried under a mound. This required enormous effort, suggesting profound beliefs about death in the afterlife. Cremation was also practiced. Bodies were burned, sometimes in ships set alight and pushed out to sea, more often in pyres. The ashes might be buried in urns or scattered. Some graves show mixed practices, partial cremation or cremated remains placed in ships that were then buried. The concept of fate, WRD or orlog in Old Norse, was fundamental. Fate was woven by the Norns, 3 female beings who sat at the base of Yggdrasil spinning the threads of destiny. Even the gods were subject to fate. Ragnarok was prophesied and inevitable. Knowing their doom awaited them didn't free the gods from it. Yet despite this determinism, individuals were expected to act with courage and honor. You might not control your fate, but you controlled how you met it. Dying bravely in battle with weapon in hand ensured the proper afterlife. Accepting inevitable death without fear was admirable. This created a paradox. Nothing mattered because fate was fixed, yet everything mattered because your response to fate determined your reputation and honor. Prophecy featured prominently in Norse mythology. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, is one of the most important mythological poems, recounting the creation of the world, the deeds of gods, and the prophecy of Ragnarok. Volva relates this to Odin, describing how the world began, how it would end, and even hinting at a rebirth after destruction. Ragnarok itself was the apocalyptic end of the current world order. The prophecy foretold a harsh winter lasting 3 years without summer. Social bonds would break down, kin would betray kin. Fenrir would break his chains, Loki would be freed, and they would lead the giants, the dead from Helheim, and various monsters against the gods. In the battle, many gods would fall. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Then Odin's son Vidar would tear the wolf apart in vengeance. Thor would kill Jormungandr but die from the serpent's poison. Tyr and the hound Garmr would slay each other. Heimdall and Loki would kill each other. Fire would consume the world and it would sink into the sea. But from this destruction, renewal would come. The world would rise again from the waters, green and fertile. A few gods would survive, including 2 of Odin's sons. 2 humans, Lif and Lifracer, would have hidden in the world tree and would emerge to repopulate the earth. The sun, swallowed by a wolf during Ragnarok, would have borne a daughter who would ride across the new sky. This cyclical view of time, creation, decline, destruction, rebirth, differs from the linear Christian view where history moves from creation to judgment. For the Norse, the wheel turned. Endings were also beginnings. When Christianity arrived, conversion was gradual and complex. Some converted genuinely. Others hedged their bets, worshipping both Christ and the old gods. Baptized but dedicated to Thor appears in some sources, describing people who accepted Christianity outwardly while maintaining old practices privately. Christian missionaries sometimes emphasized similarities. One all-powerful God wasn't so different from Odin. Jesus' sacrifice echoed Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil. Christian miracles weren't so different from the gods' deeds. Churches were sometimes built on old sacred sites, transferring sanctity from old religion to new. But fundamental differences existed. Christianity promised salvation through faith and good works, afterlife in heaven or hell based on moral behavior. Norse religion offered little assurance of anything beyond maintaining honor and reputation. Christianity was inclusive in theory, offering salvation to all who believed. Norse religion was ethnic and practical. concerned more with successful harvests and victory in battle than with theological abstractions. The conversion of Scandinavia took centuries and was often driven by political considerations. Kings who converted gained legitimacy in Christian Europe, access to international diplomatic networks, support from the Church. Canute the Great, ruling Denmark, Norway, and England in the early 11th century, was a Christian king of Vikings, demonstrating that Christianity and Norse identity weren't incompatible. Yet the old beliefs persisted in folklore, in place names, in practices that were Christianized on the surface but retained pagan elements beneath. The names of gods survived in the days of the week: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Woden, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigg. Practices associated with the old religion, festival timing, certain customs around death and harvest, were absorbed into Christian practice or continued as folk traditions, supposedly separate from religion. The myths themselves survived because they were written down, ironically by Christian scribes in Iceland several centuries after conversion. The prose Edda and poetic Edda, the primary sources for Norse mythology, were compiled in the 13th century, 3 centuries after Iceland's conversion. Yet they preserve stories and poems from the pagan period, albeit filtered through a Christian worldview. Norse religion wasn't a religion of salvation or ultimate meaning. It was a pragmatic system for understanding a harsh world, for explaining natural phenomena, for providing structure to life and comfort in death. It celebrated strength, courage, loyalty, and honor. It acknowledged the world's injustice and cruelty without trying to explain them away. It promised only that if you lived and died well, you would be remembered, your reputation would endure, and perhaps you'd feast with gods and heroes until the world's ending. This worldview shaped Viking society profoundly, encouraging the risk-taking, the exploration, the combat, the loyalty to kin and lord that characterized the Viking Age. When we try to understand why Vikings acted as they did, we must understand they did so in a universe of gods who rewarded boldness, where death and glory was the highest achievement, where fate was fixed but response to fate was everything. The Viking Age didn't end suddenly. It faded gradually through the 11th century, concluding symbolically in 1066 with the death of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Multiple factors contributed to this transformation: the Christianization of Scandinavia, the consolidation of centralized kingdoms, improved defenses in targeted regions, and changes in Scandinavia itself. Christianization was perhaps the most fundamental change. Religion affected everything: legal systems, social customs, concepts of legitimate authority, international relations. As Scandinavia converted, it was gradually incorporated into mainstream Christian European civilization. Denmark converted first. King Harald Bluetooth, ruling in the mid-10th century, converted around 960, though the exact date and circumstances are uncertain. According to tradition, a Christian missionary named Poppo demonstrated Christ's power by carrying hot iron without injury, convincing Harald of Christianity's superiority. Whether the story is true or not, Harald's conversion was politically motivated. A Christian king could negotiate with other Christian powers as an equal, could marry into European royal families, could claim legitimacy in ways pagan rulers couldn't. Harald erected the famous Jelling Stone, a runestone declaring he had made the Danes Christian. The stone features both Christian imagery, a crucifixion scene, and traditional Norse artistic styles, embodying the transition between old and new. Churches were built, some on old pagan sites. Missionaries arrived, typically from Germany or England. The old gods were officially abandoned. But conversion wasn't instant or complete. Rural areas resisted longer than towns. Many people maintained old practices privately while conforming outwardly to Christianity. Burial practices show a gradual transition, with grave goods declining but not disappearing immediately, Christian symbols appearing alongside older ones. Norway's conversion was more violent. King Olaf Tryggvason, ruling from 995 to 1000, attempted to force conversion through intimidation and violence. Those who refused baptism faced execution, mutilation, or exile. Olaf destroyed pagan temples, executed resistant leaders, and used his royal authority to impose Christianity from the top down. Olaf fell in battle against a coalition of his enemies in the year 1000. After a period of political chaos, Norway came under the control of Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, who continued the Christianization process. Olaf was more systematic, establishing churches, bringing in bishops and priests, creating a Christian administrative infrastructure. He died in 1030 at the Battle of Stiklestad, fighting against Norwegian nobles who opposed his rule. Miracles were reported at his grave, and he was declared a saint. Saint Olav became Norway's patron saint, and his cult helped solidify Christianity's position. Sweden converted last. King Olaf Skakkonung was baptized around 1008, the first Christian Swedish king. But pagan practices persisted, particularly at Uppsala, a major pagan cult center. Not until the late 11th or early 12th century was Sweden definitively Christian. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing around 1070, describes Uppsala's pagan temple where human and animal sacrifices continued, suggesting that even then paganism had strongholds. Iceland's conversion was peaceful and uniquely deliberate. At the Althing in the year 1000, the assembly debated conversion. Both Christian and pagan factions argued their cases. To prevent civil war, the law-speaker Thorgils Spetningaji, though a pagan himself, declared that Iceland would adopt Christianity as its official religion. Importantly, he allowed private pagan worship to continue. This pragmatic decision satisfied most parties, and Iceland converted with minimal violence. Christianity brought profound changes. Christian sexual morality differed from Norse practices. Concubinage was discouraged, though not immediately eliminated. Marriage became a sacrament with Christian rules. Divorce became more difficult. The church opposed blood feuds, promoted peace, and offered alternatives to violence for settling disputes. Christian kingship differed from traditional Norse leadership. Kings ruled by divine right, not merely by strength and consent of powerful followers. Hereditary succession according to Christian principles replaced the Norse practice where any suitable male relative might claim kingship. The church supported strong centralized monarchy, which in turn supported the church. Laws changed. Christian concepts of sin and salvation influenced legal codes. Certain offenses became sins against God, not just crimes against people. Church courts claimed jurisdiction over some matters. Ecclesiastical penalties, penance, excommunication, supplemented secular punishments. Economic practices shifted. The slave trade declined as Christianity opposed enslaving fellow Christians. This removed a major Viking income source. Raiding Christian lands became theologically problematic for Christian kings. Trading replaced raiding as the primary means of obtaining foreign wealth. Architectural and artistic styles evolved. Stone churches replaced wooden pagan temples. Christian art, with its crosses, saints, and biblical scenes, replaced Norse animal interlaced designs, though for a time they coexisted, creating hybrid styles. Literacy increased as churches established schools to train clergy. Latin learning entered Scandinavia. Political consolidation accompanied Christianization. The fragmented Scandinavia of warring petty kingdoms was replaced by consolidated realms under strong monarchs. This happened at different rates in different areas, but the trend was consistent. Denmark achieved unity relatively early. Harald Bluetooth consolidated power in the mid-10th century. His successors, particularly Canute the Great, expanded Danish power dramatically. Canute ruled a North Sea empire in the early 11th century, controlling Denmark, Norway, and England simultaneously. Though this empire fragmented after his death in 1035, it demonstrated how far Scandinavian power politics had evolved from the decentralized raiding bands of earlier centuries. Norway's unification was more contested. Harald Fairhair, in the late 9th century, claimed to have unified Norway, though how complete his control actually was is debated. Later kings struggled against regional power centers. But by the mid-11th century, Norway was a recognizable kingdom with centralized authority, Christian institutions, and international connections. Sweden's unification was slowest, with regional powers maintaining independence into the 12th century. But even there, the trend toward centralization was evident. Why did centralization matter for ending the Viking Age? Because centralized Christian kingdoms had different incentives and operated under different constraints than decentralized pagan societies. A king needed to maintain relations with other Christian powers, to uphold treaties, to conform to Christian European norms. Kings had more to lose from unauthorized raiding that might provoke retaliation. They wanted stability, not constant warfare. The military organization changed. Monarchs developed permanent retinues, proto-professional armies that replaced the temporary raiding bands led by jarls. Naval forces were organized by royal authority, not by independent adventurers. The Ledang, a naval levy system where regions had to provide ships and crews, allowed kings to mobilize large fleets but kept them under royal control. Defense improvements in targeted regions also mattered. England under Alfred the Great had begun building burhs, fortified towns that provided refuge and bases for military response. This system was expanded by Alfred's successors. By the mid-10th century, Much of England had defensive networks that made Viking raiding more difficult and less profitable. Continental Europe also improved defenses. Fortifications were strengthened, warning systems established, mobile forces organized that could respond to raids quickly. The Vikings' advantage of surprise and mobility decreased as defenders adapted. Economic changes in Scandinavia itself reduced incentives for raiding. Trade had always been part of Viking activity, but it became increasingly dominant. Towns like Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and Koppang in Norway became important trading centers. Merchants who conducted regular trade had more to gain from peaceful commerce than from raiding that might disrupt trade networks. The climate may have played a role too. The medieval warm period that facilitated Viking expansion began ending in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Cooler temperatures meant harsher conditions in marginal settlements like Greenland, shorter growing seasons, increased sea ice. The easy mobility that had enabled Viking expansion became more difficult. Internal development in Scandinavia absorbed energy and resources that might otherwise have gone into external adventures. Consolidating kingdoms, establishing churches and administrative systems, internal conflicts between rival claimants to thrones, all this focused attention inward. The last great Viking campaign was launched by Harald Hardrada in 1066. Harald's life embodied the Viking Age's last decades. Born around 1015, he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 at age 15. Where his half-brother King Olaf fell. Fleeing Norway, Harald traveled east, joined the Varangian Guard, fought for Byzantium in the Mediterranean and Middle East, accumulated wealth and military experience. Returning to Scandinavia in the 1040s, Harald claimed the Norwegian throne, ruling from 1047. He was a throwback, the kind of warrior adventurer that earlier generations would have celebrated. He led raids on Denmark, fought wars to expand his kingdom, maintained the old traditions even as Christianity took deeper root. In 1066, Harold saw an opportunity in England. King Edward the Confessor had died without direct heirs. Harold Godwin's son took the English throne, but his claim was disputed. Harold Hardrada, claiming a right to the English throne through complex earlier agreements, invaded northern England with a fleet of 300 ships and thousands of warriors. Initially successful, Harold's forces won the Battle of Fulford, defeating English forces near York. But Harold Godwin's son marched north with remarkable speed. The armies met at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. The battle was brutal and decisive. Harold Hardrada was killed, shot through the throat with an arrow according to one account. The Norwegian army was shattered. Of the 300 ships that arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge is conventionally taken as the Viking Age's end. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was symbolic. Harald Hardrada was the last great Viking warrior king in the traditional mold, and his death marked the passing of an era. 3 days later, William the Conqueror landed in southern England, and Harold Godwin's son had to march his exhausted army south to face a new threat, leading to his defeat at Hastings. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were themselves descended from Vikings. Rollo, a Viking leader, had been granted territory in northern France in 911, establishing what became the Duchy of Normandy. The Normans preserved some Viking characteristics, military prowess, organization, ambition, but were thoroughly Christianized and Frankish in culture. William the Conqueror was culturally a French duke, not a Viking chieftain, though his great-great-great-great-grandfather had been a pagan Norwegian or Danish warlord. After Stamford Bridge, Viking raids didn't cease immediately, but they were increasingly anachronistic. Norwegian expeditions against Scotland and Ireland continued sporadically into the 12th century. But these were not the world-shaking movements of earlier centuries. They were minor conflicts on the periphery of European politics. Scandinavia itself moved forward into the High Middle Ages as part of Christian Europe. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden evolved into the forms that, with modifications, persist today. They participated in crusades, in European dynastic politics, in the broader currents of medieval civilization. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 793 to 1066. 273 years. In that time, seafarers from Scandinavia had reached 4 continents, founded states that still exist, influenced languages, cultures, and political systems across vast regions, and left an indelible mark on medieval civilization. Their ending wasn't defeat so much as transformation. Vikings didn't disappear. They became Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Normans, Russ. They converted to Christianity, built kingdoms, wrote laws, established institutions. The energy that had expressed itself through raiding and exploration was channeled into state building and participation in European Christian civilization. Yet something was lost too. The wild freedom of the early Viking Age, when a jarl could outfit a ship and sail where he wished, seeking adventure and wealth, answerable to no higher authority, that freedom couldn't survive the rise of organized Christian monarchies. The raw energy and daring that launched longships into unknown seas was domesticated, controlled, redirected into channels acceptable to medieval European civilization. Whether this was progress depends on perspective. For those who had suffered Viking raids, the end of the Viking Age brought relief and security. For those who value order, stability, and the cultural achievements of high medieval civilization, the transformation was positive. But for those who admire courage, adventure, and individual freedom, the Viking Age's end was also the loss of something irreplaceable, a time when the limits of the possible seemed boundless and the world was there for the taking by those bold enough to try. The image of Vikings in popular imagination is often distorted, a mixture of authentic history, romantic embellishment, and outright fiction. Separating what Vikings actually were from what later generations imagined them to be requires examining both the historical record and the process by which Viking mythology was constructed. The most famous Viking myth is easily debunked. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. This image, so deeply embedded in popular culture, has no basis in archaeological or historical evidence. No Viking helmet with horns has ever been found. Depictions from the Viking Age itself, carvings, illustrations, artifacts, show either conical or rounded metal helmets, or more often, no helmets at all, since they were expensive. So where did the horn helmet come from? The 19th century, specifically from Romantic nationalism and opera. In 1876, costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for the Viking characters in Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen. The image captured imaginations and spread rapidly through art and popular culture. It became the visual shorthand for Viking, despite being completely false. Why does this matter? Because the horned helmet myth is emblematic of a broader 19th century romanticization of Vikings that distorted understanding. In the 1800s, nationalist movements across Europe sought historical legitimacy. Scandinavians, Germans, and English all claimed Viking heritage. But they created a mythologized version that served contemporary political and cultural agendas. The Romantic movement valued the primitive, the natural, the heroic. Vikings were reimagined as noble barbarians, fierce warriors who lived free and died bravely, uncorrupted by civilization's softness. This Viking was a nationalist symbol, representing ethnic purity and martial valor. But this Viking was as much invention as recovery, a projection of 19th century desires onto a misunderstood past. Victorian scholars contributed too. They translated sagas, studied runestones, popularized Norse mythology. But they did so through Victorian sensibilities, sometimes sanitizing content, imposing moral frameworks foreign to the source material. The sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age by Christian Icelanders, were treated as straightforward history rather than as literary works that blend history, legend, and authorial creativity. Archaeological discoveries complicated matters. Ship burials at Gokstad and Oseberg revealed magnificent vessels and rich grave goods, fueling fascination. But these elite burials weren't representative of typical Vikings any more than studying only royal tombs would give a complete picture of any civilization. The dramatic finds overshadowed the ordinary. The thousands of simple graves, the everyday artifacts, the farmsteads and workshops where most Vikings spent their lives. Modern popular culture continues to distort. Movies and television shows feature Vikings with leather armor, covered in tattoos, screaming war cries, engaging in wild berserker rages. Some of this has historical basis, some doesn't. Berserkers, warriors who fought in trance-like fury, are mentioned in sagas and histories. The word possibly derives from bear shirt, suggesting warriors who wore bear skins. They were described as fighting with superhuman strength, impervious to pain, howling and biting their shields before battle. Were they real? Probably in some form. Whether this was a genuine psychological state, the result of drugs or alcohol, ritualized behavior, or later exaggeration is debated. Tattoos are possible but unproven. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab traveler who encountered Rus on the Volga, described them as covered in tattoos from fingertips to neck. But his is the only detailed description, and it's unclear if this was universal Viking practice, specific to Eastern Vikings, or his misunderstanding. No preserved Viking skin shows tattoos, though this is unsurprising given preservation conditions. Tattoos were common in many cultures Vikings encountered, so borrowing the practice is plausible. The honest answer is we don't know for certain. The brutality of Vikings is often exaggerated but also sometimes understated. Yes, Vikings raided, killed, and enslaved. Contemporary Christian sources describe horrific violence. Monasteries sacked, priests murdered at altars, captives killed or taken. These accounts aren't fabrications. Viking raids were traumatic events for those who experienced them. But Christian sources had biases. Vikings were pagans attacking Christians, so accounts emphasized their savagery and framed raids as divine punishment for sin. The violence was real, but the descriptions were shaped by religious and cultural frameworks that painted Vikings as instruments of demonic forces. Vikings weren't uniquely violent for their era. Medieval Europe was saturated with violence. Christians warred against Christians constantly. The Carolingian Empire, supposed defender of Christendom, engaged in brutal conquest and forced conversion. The difference was that Christian-on-Christian violence was normalized and justified, while Viking violence shocked because it came from outside the Christian world and targeted sacred spaces. Archaeological evidence reveals a more complex reality. Viking graves show people who died in combat but also people who died from disease, accidents, old age. The majority of Viking bones show no signs of violent death. Most Vikings were farmers, traders, craftspeople whose lives involved no more violence than was typical for medieval society. Women's roles are often simplified in popular depictions. The shield maiden narrative appeals to modern sensibilities, and as mentioned, some evidence supports women warriors in limited contexts. But most Viking women's power came through household management, property rights, and social influence, not through combat. The sagas feature strong women. Gernothrfr's daughter in Laxdæla saga, who survives 4 marriages and dominates every man in her life. Honor the deep-minded in Laxdæla saga, who leads her family to Iceland after her husband's death and becomes a powerful settlement leader. These women wield influence through intelligence, social networking, and force of personality, not through picking up swords. DNA evidence is revolutionizing our understanding. Studies of British and Irish populations show significant Scandinavian genetic contribution, evidence of settlement, not just raiding. But interestingly, this genetic influence is predominantly male line, suggesting Viking men took local wives or at least had children with local women. This fits with historical accounts of Viking men settling in foreign lands and integrating into local populations. The Viking diaspora wasn't just warriors. It included farmers, merchants, craftspeople, families seeking new lives. The DNA evidence, combined with place name studies and linguistic analysis, reveals extensive settlement and mixing, creating hybrid cultures particularly in areas like the Danelaw, Normandy, the Rus territories, and Irish port cities. The clean Viking myth versus the filthy barbarian stereotype both oversimplify. Vikings were clean by medieval standards, bathing regularly, grooming carefully, as evident from grooming kits found in graves. But medieval standards were not modern standards. Weekly bathing would have been exemplary hygiene for the period, even if it seems inadequate to us. The notion of Vikings as democratic because of the Thing overstates the case. The Thing was not a modern democracy with equal votes. It was an assembly of free men, excluding thralls and often excluding women. Wealthy and powerful men dominated proceedings. But compared to the hierarchical Christian societies where kings ruled by divine right and subjects had no formal voice, the Thing did represent a more participatory governance model. Legal equality within the class of freemen was real. A carl could bring legal action against a jarl if wronged. The law, recited publicly, applied theoretically to all free men equally. This was unusual in medieval Europe where aristocrats often operated above laws that constrained commoners. But in practice, wealth and connections influenced outcomes in Viking societies as in all human societies. The Viking discovery of America is sometimes exaggerated into sustained contact and influence. The archaeological evidence at Lance aux Meadows proves Vikings reached North America and attempted settlement. But there's no evidence of lasting impact. The Norse attempt at colonization failed. No sustained trade developed. Indigenous American cultures showed no Scandinavian influence from this period. For practical historical purposes, the Norse discovery of America led nowhere. Claims of additional Norse sites in North America beyond Lance aux Meadows are highly controversial. Artifacts like the Kensington runestone, the Maine penny, and others have been presented as evidence of broader Norse presence, but most are considered forgeries or explained through other means by mainstream archaeology. This doesn't mean no other sites exist. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but confirmed sites remain rare. The environmental impact of Viking settlement, particularly in Iceland and Greenland, is now recognized as significant. Iceland was extensively forested when Norse settlers arrived. Within a few centuries, most forests were cleared, leading to soil erosion that still affects the island. The environmental carrying capacity of Greenland was always marginal, and overgrazing combined with climate change contributed to the settlement's eventual failure. This complicates the image of Vikings as living in harmony with nature. They were medieval people using medieval agricultural practices, not especially sustainable by modern standards. They transformed environments they settled, sometimes in ways that ultimately proved destructive. The Vikings' technological sophistication is sometimes underestimated in popular portrayals that emphasize brute strength over skill. Viking ships were engineering marvels that matched or exceeded anything else contemporary European civilization produced. Their metalworking created weapons equal to any in medieval Europe. Their navigational achievements, crossing open oceans without modern instruments, demonstrate sophisticated practical knowledge. Yet they weren't technologically advanced across the board. Scandinavian agricultural technology was adequate but not exceptional. Their architecture, primarily timber construction, was suitable for their environment but less impressive than stone building in other regions. They adopted technologies from cultures they encountered, shipbuilding techniques from encounters with other maritime cultures, urban planning from established trading cities, as much as inventing their own. The transition to Christianity is sometimes depicted as either heroic conversion or tragic betrayal of traditional culture. The reality was more prosaic: political calculation, gradual adoption, syncretism, resistance in some places, enthusiastic embrace in others. For most people, the change probably involved maintaining as much of familiar life as possible while adapting to new religious requirements. Christianity didn't instantly change Viking character. Christian Scandinavians continued fighting, exploring, and trading much as their pagan ancestors had. Norman conquest of England, Varangian service in Byzantium, Norwegian campaigns in the North Atlantic, all occurred after Christianization. What changed were the frameworks of legitimacy and the international relationships these activities occurred within. The artistic legacy of Vikings is sometimes reduced to dragon heads and interlace patterns. But Viking art evolved significantly over 3 centuries, incorporating influences from Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Carolingian, and Byzantine art while maintaining distinctive characteristics. The in-style of the late Viking Age shows remarkable sophistication in its flowing, elegant lines. Literary legacy is profound but indirect. The Icelandic sagas are masterpieces, but they were written centuries after the events they describe, by Christian authors looking back at a pagan past with mixed nostalgia and disapproval. They are historical sources but must be read critically, not taken as literal truth. The problem with Viking mythology, whether from the 19th century or today, is that it serves contemporary agendas rather than historical understanding. Nationalists claimed Vikings as symbols of ethno-purity. White supremacists have appropriated Norse symbols, distorting them for hateful purposes. Fantasy literature and media create Vikings that are more entertaining than accurate. None of this is the Vikings' fault. They were historical people who lived in specific times and places, shaped by particular circumstances, acting according to beliefs and values we can partially understand through archaeology, texts, and analysis. They weren't noble savages, weren't demons, weren't prototypes of modern national characters. They were medieval Scandinavians, no more, no less. Recovering authentic Viking history requires careful examination of evidence, awareness of biases and sources, willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, and resistance to the temptation to make Vikings into whatever we want them to be. The actual Vikings, freed from mythology, emerge as complex, contradictory, recognizably human, capable of great courage and great cruelty, sophisticated in some ways and limited in others, shaped by their culture and environment yet exercising agency in remarkable ways. They were people who looked at seas others feared and saw highways, who faced unknown territories with more curiosity than dread, who built a maritime culture of stunning capability, who influenced the course of medieval history across 3 continents, who left genetic, linguistic, cultural, and political legacies that persist a millennium after their age ended. This real Viking story, freed from horned helmets and romantic exaggeration, is far more fascinating than any myth. The Viking Age ended over 950 years ago, yet its echoes remain embedded in modern civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The impact of these Scandinavian seafarers extended far beyond their own time, shaping languages, political systems, genetic heritage, and cultural memory across vast regions. The linguistic legacy is extensive and intimate. English, particularly, carries hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse during the Viking Age. These aren't obscure technical terms. They're fundamental vocabulary used constantly. Sky, egg, cake, knife, husband, window, anger, wrong, law, take, get, give, they, their, them, these common words all derive from Old Norse. The Scandinavian influence is stronger in Northern and Eastern English dialects, the areas of the Danelaw where Viking settlement was concentrated. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, these regions' speech retains more Norse influence than Southern English. Grammatical structures were affected too. English lost many case endings and simplified its grammar partly through contact with Old Norse, which was similar but not identical. When speakers of closely related languages communicate, they tend to simplify, using most basic common forms, and this is reflected in English's evolution. Scottish English, particularly in areas of Viking settlement like the Orkney and Shetland Islands, retains even more Norse influence. Place names there are often entirely Norse in origin. Scots Gaelic borrowed some Norse words. Irish has Norse loanwords, particularly relating to maritime activities and trade, entered during the Viking Age when Norse Gaelic kingdoms dominated Irish port cities. French has some Norse influence through Normandy, though most was filtered and modified through the Romance language structure. Norman French, brought to England in 1066, included Norse-derived elements that then entered English again, creating layers of influence. Russian and Ukrainian claim linguistic descent from the Rus, though the Scandinavian rulers adopted Slavic language, leaving primarily the name and some political terminology. Finnish and Estonian have Norse loanwords from Viking Age contact. Place names across Europe testify to Viking presence. In England, names ending in by, farm or settlement, thorp, village, toft, homestead, and thwaite, clearing, are Norse in origin. York was Jorvik in Viking times. Derby, Whitby, Scunthorpe, thousands of settlements bear Norse names or Norse-influenced names. In Scotland and its islands, Norse place names dominate in areas of Viking settlement. Iceland's place names are entirely Norse. Greenland's Norse place names persist alongside Inuit names. Even Vinland, though the Norse settlement failed, left a name, albeit one we can't precisely locate anymore. In Normandy, place names ending in beck, fleur, and tuck show Norse influence mixed with French. The Normans were Vikings who'd adopted French language and culture, but Norse influence didn't entirely disappear. In Russia and Ukraine, major cities like Novgorod and, less directly, Kiev trace their founding to the Rus. The name Russia itself derives from the Norse term for the Swedish Vikings who established themselves there. Genetic studies reveal Viking heritage across populations. In Iceland, genetic studies show population predominantly descends from Norwegian settlers and Celtic women, particularly from Ireland and Scotland. This reflects the saga accounts of settlers bringing Celtic slaves and wives. Icelandic population has been relatively isolated since settlement, making it valuable for genetic research. In Britain and Ireland, significant Scandinavian genetic contribution is evident, particularly in areas of Viking settlement. Orkney Islands show very high Scandinavian ancestry. Parts of northern and eastern England show substantial Norse genetic markers. Irish coastal populations have Scandinavian contributions reflecting Viking settlement in Dublin and other port cities. Normandy's population shows Scandinavian genetic markers, though mixed with French and other populations over centuries. The Norman conquest of England meant Scandinavian-ascended Normans contributed further to English genetic makeup, though by then they were culturally French. Scandinavian populations themselves show the genetic impact of the Viking Age's mobility and mixing. Eastern Swedish populations show genetic connections to the Baltic and Russia, reflecting Rush trade routes. Norwegian populations on the western coast show connections to Scotland and Ireland, reflecting back-and-forth movement across the North Sea. Danish genetic makeup reflects southern Scandinavian connections and influences from continental Europe. Genetic studies also complicate simple narratives. The Viking Age involved significant female movement as well as male, though patterns varied by region. Population mixing was extensive, creating hybrid populations genetically as well as culturally. Political legacies are complex and indirect. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was executed by descendants of Vikings, though culturally they were French by that point. Norman systems of administration, law, and feudalism shaped England's political development. These eventually influenced systems in Britain's later empire and in the United States. creating chains of influence stretching from Viking Normandy to modern political systems worldwide. The Thing assembly influenced governance in areas of Viking settlement. Iceland's Althing, in continuous operation with some interruptions, since 930, claims to be the world's oldest parliament, though this is debated. Regardless, the concept of assemblies where free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes influenced governance concepts in Scandinavia and areas of Viking settlement. Legal traditions show influence too. English common law, developing in the medieval period, incorporated elements from Anglo-Saxon law, which had been influenced by Viking legal concepts in the Danelaw. The jury system has been speculatively linked to Scandinavian practices, though the connection is debated. What's clear is that legal culture in areas of Viking settlement was shaped by synthesis of existing and Norse traditions. Scandinavian kingdoms evolved into modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These nations' historical continuity extends back through the Viking Age to the kingdoms that consolidated during and after that period. The cultural memory of the Viking Age remains significant in Scandinavian national identities, though understanding has evolved from 19th-century romanticization to more nuanced historical awareness. Commercial and maritime traditions show continuity. Scandinavia remained important in maritime trade after the Viking Age. The Hanseatic League, dominating Baltic trade in the later medieval and early modern periods, built on trading networks and port cities established during the Viking Age. Scandinavian fishing and whaling industries continued traditions that reached back to Viking practices. The cultural memory of Vikings has waxed and waned over centuries. In the immediate post-Viking medieval period, they were remembered primarily through saga literature in Iceland and through English and continental chronicles that emphasized the destruction and suffering they caused. The Catholic Church's view was generally negative. Pagans who'd attacked Christendom converted only gradually. During the Renaissance, there was limited interest in Vikings, overshadowed by classical Greek and Roman civilizations. The Enlightenment saw some antiquarian interest, with scholars beginning to study Old Norse literature and runestones, but Vikings weren't prominent in broader European consciousness. The 19th century brought dramatic revival. Romantic nationalism across Europe sought heroic national origins. Scandinavians rediscovered Vikings as ancestors and national symbols. Germans claimed kinship with Germanic tribes including Vikings. British noted Viking contributions to English heritage. This led to scholarly work, translation of sagas, archaeological excavations, historical studies, but also to romanticization and appropriation for nationalist ideologies. Wagner's Ring Cycle, though based more on German legends than strictly Viking material, helped popularize Norse mythology. The horned helmet mistake emerged from this period. Vikings were reimagined as proto-nationalists, racially pure warriors, representing everything from noble freedom to martial supremacy depending on who was doing the imagining. The 20th century saw both scholarly advancement and continued popular fascination. Archaeology revealed extensive new information. The discovery of Lance Aux meadows proved the Vinland sagas had historical basis. Linguistic studies revealed the depth of Norse influence on European languages. DNA analysis opened new avenues for understanding Viking Age population movements and mixing. Popular culture embraced Vikings enthusiastically if not always accurately. Comic books, films, television shows, fantasy literature, video games, Vikings became fixtures of popular entertainment. This raised awareness but often perpetuated myths. The horned helmet persisted despite archaeologists' protestations. Vikings were depicted as either noble heroes or savage barbarians depending on the story's needs. The 21st century has seen more nuanced portrayals alongside continued romanticization. Scholarly work emphasizes Vikings as complex historical people, neither uniquely evil nor romantically heroic. Popular culture sometimes reflects this, creating more historically informed depictions, though simplified and exaggerated versions persist. Viking symbols and imagery have been unfortunately appropriated by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, distorting Norse heritage for hateful purposes. This has created tension in how Viking symbols are perceived and used. Mainstream Norse heritage organizations and scholars actively combat this appropriation, emphasizing that historical Vikings were not the racially pure ethno-nationalists these groups imagine and that using Norse symbols for hate distorts their actual historical and cultural significance. Tourism in Scandinavia includes significant Viking heritage components. Museums, reconstructed settlements, Viking ship replicas, festivals, these attract visitors interested in Viking history and culture. Iceland, despite never being raided by Vikings, it was settled by them, markets Viking heritage heavily. This commercialization can distort history but also funds preservation and research. The educational legacy is significant. Vikings feature prominently in school curricula across Europe and North America as examples of medieval history, exploration, cultural contact, and historical change. They serve pedagogical purposes, complex enough to sustain study, dramatic enough to engage student interest, documented well enough to teach historical methods. Academic Viking studies remains vibrant, with ongoing archaeological excavations, reanalysis of existing material using new technologies, linguistic research, and theoretical work examining Viking Age from various perspectives. Interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeology, history, literature, genetics, climate science, and other fields create increasingly sophisticated understanding. The question, why do Vikings still matter, has various answers. For people of Scandinavian descent, Vikings are ancestors and cultural heritage. For people in areas of Viking settlement or impact, Vikings are part of local history. For scholars, Vikings offer a well-documented case study in pre-modern exploration, trade, warfare, and cultural contact. For the general public, Vikings remain fascinating because their achievements were extraordinary. Crossing oceans in open boats, establishing settlements in hostile environments, influencing civilizations across 3 continents, all with medieval technology and no guidebooks or GPS. The Viking legacy is ultimately about human capacity, courage, adaptability, technical skill, cultural creativity. The people who looked at rough seas and saw opportunity, who sailed into unknown waters with no certainty of return, who established new societies in Iceland, Greenland, briefly in North America, who traveled from Scandinavia to Constantinople, from the Arctic to North Africa, who left their mark on medieval civilization in ways that persist today. These were people remarkable not for their violence, though they could be violent, but for their sheer audacity. A millennium after the Viking Age ended, we still speak words they introduced to English. We live in political systems influenced by their governance concepts. We carry their genetic heritage. We study their ships in museums, read translations of their sagas, visit places they settled. The echoes persist not because Vikings were perfect. They weren't, but because they achieved things worthy of memory, things that expanded what medieval people thought possible, things that shaped the world we inherited. The Vikings remind us that our distant ancestors were neither primitive nor simple. They were fully human, intelligent, creative, capable of remarkable achievements and terrible deeds, building civilizations and destroying them, exploring not because they had to but because they could and wanted to. In understanding Vikings more clearly, freed from both demonization and romanticization, we understand something about human potential, about what people are capable of when culture, technology, and opportunity align. The story of the Vikings is ultimately a human story, one that begins in the cold fjords of Scandinavia and extends across medieval Europe, through the eastern river routes, across the North Atlantic, briefly touching North American shores 5 centuries before Columbus. It's a story of farmers and traders who became raiders and explorers, of societies that evolved from decentralized paganism to centralized Christian kingdoms, of a people who for roughly 3 centuries punched far above their weight in historical impact. We've journeyed from the world before 793, understanding the forces that would unleash the Viking Age, through the explosive violence of the early raids that shocked Christian Europe, into the eastern expansion that helped found states still existing today. We've crossed the Atlantic with Norse explorers, understanding why Iceland and Greenland were settled while the Vinland experiment failed. We've looked beyond the longships to understand how Vikings actually lived. Their social structures from jarls to thralls, their legal assemblies, their family lives, the roles of women, the raising of children, the communal bonds that held society together. We've explored their craftsmanship, from the engineering marvels of their ships to the deadly efficiency of their weapons, from intricate jewelry to complex textile production. We've delved into their religious world, the pantheon of gods from Odin to Thor, the cosmology of 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the beliefs about fate and destiny that shaped how Vikings understood their lives and deaths. We've traced the transformation and ending of the Viking Age through Christianization and political consolidation, ending symbolically at Stamford Bridge in 1066. We've worked to separate myth from reality, acknowledging both the genuine achievements and the exaggerations, the real violence and the romanticized distortions, the complexity that simple narratives miss. And we've examined how Viking influence echoes into our present in language, genetics, place names, political traditions, and cultural memory. The Vikings we've encountered are neither the noble barbarians of romantic imagination nor the demonic savages of medieval Christian chronicle, but something more interesting. Historical people who responded to their circumstances with remarkable courage and creativity, whose seafaring prowess enabled explorations and settlements that shaped medieval history, whose adaptability allowed them to function as raiders, traders, settlers, and eventually as Christian monarchs integrated into European civilization. Their legacy is written in the English language we speak, in the place names across Europe, in the genetic makeup of populations from Iceland to Russia, in the political concepts of assemblies and law, in the ships preserved in museums that still inspire awe. It's written in the sagas and poems that preserve their myths and histories. It's written in the archaeological evidence still being uncovered and reinterpreted with each new generation of scholars. Most fundamentally, the Viking Age reminds us that history is made by people willing to take extraordinary risks, who see possibilities where others see only barriers, who adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core identities, who leave marks on their times that echo through centuries. The Vikings changed medieval Europe not because they were superhuman but because they were ambitious, skilled, and opportunistic humans who maximized the advantages their technology, culture, and circumstances provide. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of dragon ships cutting through cold seas, of fjords and longhouses, of thing assemblies and thuggle-worthy deeds, of a world where the horizon was not a limit but an invitation, where the greatest glory came not from safety and comfort but from daring to venture beyond the known, from meeting fate with courage and facing the unknown with confidence that skill, courage, and the favor of the gods might see you through. The Viking Age is long past, but its lessons remain. That human capacity for achievement is remarkable when unleashed, that civilizations rise and fall but leave enduring marks, that our ancestors were neither simpler nor less capable than us, just working with different tools and knowledge to solve the universal human challenges of survival, meaning, and legacy. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Viking history. If you found this exploration valuable, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to The Drowsy Archivist for more deep dives into history's fascinating corners. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with adventure and your sleep be peaceful. Good night.